Evelyn hadn't expected it, an inheritance, of all things. It had come at the most inconvenient time, a cold winter afternoon when the wind howled outside like the ghost of some forgotten memory. She was alone in her apartment, trying to sort through papers, each one a reminder of the mess she'd inherited from her mother: clutter, old boxes, half-filled photo albums, and promises of closure that never seemed to come. The letter had been simple, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Her mother had passed away some years ago, and Evelyn hadn't thought much of the contents of the old house until now. It was a small note from an attorney, telling her that she was the sole beneficiary of her grandmother's estate, located in the small town of Hawthorne Hollow. She hadn't even known her grandmother, much less heard any details about her. And yet, here she was, sitting at her kitchen table, gripping the letter, reading the words that had been delivered like a dull thud to her gut. "You have been chosen to receive your grandmother's most prized possession. The enclosed item must be claimed in person." There was a postscript: "It is essential you come as soon as possible." At first, Evelyn had laughed. What on earth was there for her in a town she barely remembered? But the curiosity gnawed at her, and so, days later, she packed her things and made the long drive to Hawthorne Hollow. The house was much older than she'd imagined, a decaying relic of another time, nestled amongst towering trees that whispered in the breeze. It was a large, ominous building, with windows like eyes, their shades drawn. The air smelled of dust and ancient wood, the kind that clung to you like a memory you'd rather forget. The housekeeper, a quiet, frail woman named Marjorie, welcomed her with a distant smile and guided her to a sitting room at the rear of the house. The place felt like it had been frozen in time, like no one had lived there in decades. The walls were adorned with old portraits, ghosts from another century. In the center of the room, resting upon a dusty velvet cloth, was the object that had summoned Evelyn to this strange place. It was a small, delicate music box, its lacquered surface adorned with intricate gold inlays. The box had an old-world charm, though there was something unsettling about it, something Evelyn couldn't place. The tiny ballerina inside, frozen in a delicate pirouette, seemed too perfect, too lifelike. Marjorie had only one thing to say as she handed it to Evelyn. "Your grandmother loved it dearly. She always said it knew when you needed it." Evelyn had laughed uneasily. "What do you mean, it knew?" Marjorie's gaze lingered on her for a moment, her thin lips pursed. "I think you'll find out soon enough." Evelyn had returned to her small apartment in the city a few days later, the music box sitting untouched on her bookshelf, wrapped in its silk cloth. It sat there like a strange, foreign object, calling to her, but not in any way she could understand. She could still hear Marjorie's words, echoing in her mind: "It knew when you needed it." That night, alone in her apartment, Evelyn found herself at the brink of exhaustion, both physically and emotionally. It had been a long, difficult few years for her. Work had been stressful, relationships had withered away, and memories of her mother's passing still gnawed at her heart like a slow, gnawing hunger. She sat at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of wine, her mind wandering to the lonely space she felt within herself. The walls of her apartment, which had always felt like a refuge, now felt suffocating. A sudden wave of sadness rose from within her chest, and before she could stop herself, she began to cry. The tears came in waves, thick and unrelenting, as though all the sadness she had bottled up for so long was finally being let loose. Her face flushed, and her breathing hitched as the sorrow overwhelmed her. She didn't even try to hide it. She let herself cry. That was when it happened. From the far side of the room, the music box began to play. It was soft at first, so gentle that she thought it was just her imagination. But the melody grew, almost as if it were alive, slowly increasing in volume, filling the room with the sound of its delicate, eerie tune. It was a lullaby of sorts, sweet yet strange, with a strange undercurrent of something darker. Evelyn stood frozen, staring at the box, her tears suddenly forgotten. The music filled her ears, each note perfectly in time with her heartbeat. She walked toward the shelf, unable to tear her gaze away from the box, her feet dragging on the carpet like a marionette in the hands of an invisible puppeteer. She reached out a hand, hesitating just before she touched it. The box played on, a soothing, hypnotic tune, as though it were speaking to her, calming her in a way she didn't understand. She couldn't stop herself. She opened the box. The music stopped abruptly. Evelyn jerked her hand back, as though she had touched something too hot. The air in the room had shifted, something cold, something thick, had filled the space. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. It was as though the music had never played at all, and the world outside the room had disappeared. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she stared at the box. The ballerina inside was still, unmoving, as if she had never danced. The air felt wrong. Evelyn's head swam, the room seeming to tilt on its axis. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. The sound was jarring, cutting through the stillness like a knife. She glanced at the screen. There was no caller ID, just an unknown number. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was weak, hoarse from crying. "Run," a voice said on the other end, cold and distant. It was her voice. She froze, the blood draining from her face. "Run," the voice repeated, the words stretched out, as if they were being pulled through a thin veil of static. Then the line went dead. Evelyn's chest tightened. She dropped the phone, her mind racing. Was she imagining things? Was it a prank, some cruel joke? She picked up the phone, but there was nothing but the dial tone. As she turned her gaze back to the music box, the ballerina slowly started to spin. The following days passed in a blur. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had followed her back from that strange inheritance. The music box, though silent, was now always in her line of sight. Its presence loomed over her like a shadow, and every time she looked at it, she could feel the weight of something pressing in on her chest. What had happened when the music had played? What was it about the box that had stirred such emotions inside her? And why had it responded to her tears? More troubling still was the phone call. That voice. Her own voice, sounding desperate, panicked. What was it trying to warn her about? Her mind swirled with questions and fears. She didn't want to think about it. She didn't want to confront whatever had begun to unravel in her life. But no matter how hard she tried to move on, to bury the memory of the phone call, the music box remained, its silent presence haunting her every waking moment. She knew one thing for sure now. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was coming. Evelyn couldn't sleep that night. Her mind swirled with confusion, questions hanging like ghosts in the air. The phone call, the music box, the way the ballerina had started to spin after she heard that voice, none of it made sense. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, maybe some strange glitch in the phone line. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She could feel it in her bones, a cold sensation that crawled up her spine and settled at the base of her neck. The next morning, as the sun barely began to rise, Evelyn found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the music box. It sat there on her bookshelf, its delicate golden edges glimmering in the soft morning light. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend it didn't exist, but she couldn't. It called to her, silently urging her to understand its secrets. She stood and walked to the shelf, her hand reaching out as if guided by something invisible. When her fingers touched the box, she felt the familiar shiver, the one she couldn't explain. She lifted it carefully, the smooth wood cool under her fingers, and took it to the kitchen table. For a long while, she just stared at it, wondering why it had been left to her, why her grandmother had cherished it so much. Her grandmother, the woman she had only met once, when she was a child. It was all so strange. Evelyn's curiosity finally got the better of her, and she slowly opened the box again. This time, the ballerina didn't just spin. It moved like it had been activated, its delicate arms twisting with a fluidity that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. The music started too, soft and slow at first, like it had been waiting all this time for her to open the box. But it wasn't the same melody from before. It was different now, more discordant, like a lullaby twisted into something unsettling. She closed the box in a panic, her heart thundering in her chest. But the moment she did, the sound stopped. The ballerina froze in mid-spin. A single tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. The day passed slowly. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the music box. It consumed her thoughts, gnawing at her mind like a hunger she couldn't satisfy. The phone call, the haunting melody, it all felt like a riddle wrapped in a mystery. What did it want from her? What did the box know that she didn't? She picked up the phone and dialed the number that had appeared on her caller ID the previous night, the unknown number that had caused her such dread. The line rang several times, and Evelyn's anxiety built with each passing second. Would it be her voice again? Was it going to happen again? It wasn't. A stranger's voice answered the phone. Hello? Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling despite herself. This is James, sir. Who's calling? The voice was warm, casual, like it was an ordinary conversation. I don't know, Evelyn stammered. I received a call last night from this number. It was my own voice. I don't know who it was, but it told me to run. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. James didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Ma'am, you're sure? That number's been inactive for years. It's not possible. Evelyn felt a chill run through her veins. What do you mean it's not possible? The number you're referring to is an old landline from a house that's been abandoned for decades. There's no way you could have received a call from it, James said, his tone suddenly colder, more distant. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. But I did. I swear it. I heard my own voice. I don't know what to tell you, James replied, his voice almost mechanical now. Maybe you should see a doctor. But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. That number, hadn't existed for years, and yet it had been on her caller ID. She hung up, her mind spinning. The next few nights were filled with restless dreams. Evelyn would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, drenched in sweat, and the sound of the music box playing would haunt her. It would start slow, like before, but the tune was never quite the same. It always shifted, warping into something darker, more sinister. The days felt like they were slipping away. She couldn't focus on anything, her work, her friends, even the television. Nothing seemed real anymore. The world outside her apartment seemed distant, as if she was no longer a part of it. One evening, after another exhausting day, Evelyn sat at her desk, her hands resting on the cool wood. Her apartment was silent, save for the occasional hum of traffic outside. She hadn't cried in days, but there was a heaviness inside her, a weight she couldn't shake. The music box sat on her shelf, waiting, watching. Evelyn finally stood, almost in a trance, and walked over to it. She opened the box. This time, the melody was different again. But it was familiar in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the song, but the feeling behind it. There was something in that music, something that spoke to her on a deeper level. It made her think of her mother, of her childhood, of things she'd forgotten. Her chest tightened, and without realizing it, she started to cry again. The tears were slow at first, but they came in waves, pulling from some deep well inside her. She couldn't stop them. She didn't want to. The ballerina began to spin, and the music became louder, more frantic. She had barely noticed the phone ringing, but when she answered, the familiar chill crept up her spine. It was the same voice as before, the voice of someone who knew her, someone who knew things about her that she couldn't understand. "Run," the voice said. "You have to run." This time, the voice was clear, but there was an edge to it, something jagged, like it was tearing through her mind. Evelyn's heart raced, and she could feel the heat rising in her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice breaking. The line was silent for a moment, and then the voice came again, slower, more deliberate. "You don't understand yet, Evelyn. It's already too late." The call ended. Evelyn's breath came in short, panic bursts. The music from the box had stopped, but she could still hear it echoing in her mind, repeating the same eerie lullaby. She turned toward the box, but the ballerina was still, frozen in place. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Her hand trembled as she reached for the box again. It had been too quiet for too long. The next few days blurred together for Evelyn, as though she were living in a haze. Her mind was caught in a loop of confusion, the eerie music box playing in the background of her thoughts, haunting her every waking moment. She tried to go to work, but couldn't focus. She tried to eat, but couldn't taste anything. Every part of her life felt overshadowed by the relentless pull of the music, as if it was guiding her towards something she wasn't ready to understand. She kept the music box on her desk now, where she could see it at all times. She had to keep it in sight, to remind herself that it was real, that it wasn't some nightmare she would wake up from. Every time the memories of that phone call hit her, her gaze would drift toward it. The ballerina had stopped spinning, but Evelyn wasn't sure for how long. It felt like the box was waiting for something. And then it happened again. The music, soft at first, began to play on its own, filling the apartment with that unsettling lullaby. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and her eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows. The phone call hadn't come in days, but she could still hear the voice in her head, still feel its grip tightening around her. She wasn't alone. Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to feel that helpless, haunted sensation that always seemed to accompany her tears. But it was as if something within her was pulling the strings, like the box was connected to her very soul. The moment the first tear dropped, the music grew louder. The ballerina in the box began spinning again, faster this time, and Evelyn felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward it. Her fingers hovered over the lid, but she hesitated, unsure of what would happen if she opened it. She didn't know if she could take any more of the madness. But it wasn't a choice. With trembling hands, she opened the box, and the room seemed to shift around her. The moment the music started, Evelyn's heart stopped. The melody, though distorted and warped, was familiar. It was the lullaby her mother used to sing to her, a soft tune she hadn't thought about in years. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her and dragging her under. She remembered the house she grew up in, the old bedroom with its peeling wallpaper and the smell of dust in the air. Her mother would sit by her bed, humming the lullaby as she combed through Evelyn's hair. She could almost feel the soft brush of her mother's fingers against her scalp. The music played louder now, and the sensation of being pulled backward in time grew stronger. Evelyn's eyes fluttered shut as memories flooded her mind, some forgotten, some buried deep beneath the surface. But as the melody grew more intense, the memories became distorted. Her mother's face blurred, her voice twisted into something sharp and cold. Evelyn's breath quickened. She opened her eyes, trying to ground herself in the present, but the music only grew more erratic. The ballerina in the box spun faster and faster, its delicate form a blur of motion. Evelyn felt as if she were slipping away, falling into the very memories she had tried to escape. In the corner of her eye, something moved, a shadow, perhaps. She turned quickly, but the room was still, the light from the lamp casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. But then it came again, like the creak of floorboards in the distance. There was something, someone, watching her. She didn't dare look away from the box. The music had become a part of her, thrumming in her chest, reverberating through her veins. And then, in the chaos of the sound, a voice broke through. It was a soft whisper at first, but it grew louder as the music swelled. A voice she recognized. Her mother's voice. "I told you not to open it." Evelyn's body went rigid. The voice, her mother's voice, had come from inside her own mind, but it felt so real. As though the music box had somehow dredged up her mother's presence from the depths of her memories. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it only intensified, the notes becoming more frantic, more urgent. "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "Stop. Please stop." But the music didn't stop. It never did. A sudden thought struck her, sharp and jagged like a shard of glass. Was the music box alive? Was it a conduit for something beyond the realm of the living? And if so, was it drawing from her own grief? From the tears she couldn't control? The memory of her mother's warning echoed in her mind. "I told you not to open it." It had been a warning, but Evelyn hadn't listened. She opened the box, and now the past was coming back to claim her. But what had happened to her mother? She tried to recall the details of her death, what little she knew. Her mother had passed away when Evelyn was only 14 from a sudden illness. The memories of her funeral were blurred, hazy. She didn't even know where her mother's things had gone after that. Had the music box been part of her inheritance? Evelyn didn't remember her grandmother ever mentioning it. But her mother's warning had been clear: don't open it. The box hadn't been a gift. It had been a trap. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face now, the salty droplets falling freely. Her chest ached with the weight of grief and terror, and her throat felt tight as if she were being suffocated by the air itself. She clutched at the sides of the box, the ballerina still spinning, the music growing louder until it seemed to fill every inch of the room. Suddenly, Evelyn gasped. The air had changed. It felt heavier, thicker, as though the room were alive with something else. She could almost feel it behind her, the sense of being watched growing unbearable. She looked around, but the room was empty, save for the shadows that danced in the corners of her vision. There was a soft rustling sound, and Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt it, a presence. Something was in the room with her, just beyond the edges of her perception. She could sense it, like the sensation of being touched without being seen. "Who's there?" she cried, her voice breaking. No answer. The music box was still playing, but now there was a new sound beneath it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving closer. Evelyn turned back toward the box, her hands trembling as she reached for it once more. The ballerina had stopped spinning. The music had stopped. But the tapping continued. And then, for the first time, Evelyn heard a voice, a man's voice, low and raspy, speaking directly behind her. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice behind Evelyn was cold, too cold. It slithered down her spine, a serpentine whisper that froze the blood in her veins. She turned sharply, her heart hammering, her breath shallow. But the room was empty. No one stood behind her. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, like the heartbeat of something ancient. The sensation of being watched had intensified. It felt as if the very walls were closing in around her, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching unnaturally, twisting as if they were alive, reaching for her. Evelyn's fingers trembled as they clutched the edge of the music box, her knuckles white. She felt as if she were teetering on the edge of some unspeakable abyss, and no matter which way she turned, there was no escape. The music box, the once innocent trinket that had only played a sweet tune, had become a portal, an anchor to a presence she couldn't comprehend. The soft, slow tapping came again, louder this time, from directly behind her, like someone standing just inches away, breathing down her neck. Evelyn couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only listen, her mind racing to make sense of the nightmare she was trapped in. Then, the tapping stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She waited, frozen, trying to steady herself. Her eyes flickered to the music box, which now sat eerily still on the desk. The ballerina wasn't spinning, and the melody had stopped abruptly. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sound, just silence. Evelyn dared to take a shaky step forward, her body screaming for her to run, to flee, but she couldn't. Something had her rooted in place, something more powerful than her fear. Her hands, though trembling, reached forward once more, and for the first time, she could feel the heat of her own breath against her fingers as they hovered over the box. A sudden surge of warmth washed over her. It felt familiar, comforting even. The room, which had been so cold and oppressive, now felt like it was alive with energy, with purpose. The air felt thick, too thick, and yet she found herself opening the box again, unable to stop herself. As the lid creaked open, the one sweet melody began to play again, softer this time, but more deliberate. It was almost as if the song had become aware of her. It was no longer a tune that comforted her, but a song that knew her, understood her, and was now playing a part in her unraveling. As the music played, something else shifted. Something that had been hidden beneath the melody, something that Evelyn hadn't been able to recognize until now, began to surface. The air around her felt electric, almost charged, and she could feel something pulling at the edges of her consciousness, as though the very fabric of reality was fraying. Evelyn's eyes blurred, her focus narrowing as she stared at the spinning ballerina. There, beneath the motion of the graceful figure, she saw something, a reflection, but it wasn't hers. Her mother's face was staring back at her, her eyes wide, lips parted in silent horror. She wasn't smiling like the last time Evelyn had seen her. No, this was a different expression, fear. A pleading look, one that begged Evelyn for something. The music picked up pace, faster now, as though it were alive, pulling Evelyn into it, pulling her back through time. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, faint but growing clearer. The words echoed in her mind, distant at first, and then louder. "I told you not to open it, Evelyn. Don't let it take you, too." Her breath caught, and her body went cold. This wasn't a memory. It was a warning. The same warning that had come from her mother the day she died. Evelyn had buried it deep in her heart, along with all the other secrets her mother had left behind. But now it was here, alive in the box, spilling forth from the music, clawing its way to the surface. It was no coincidence that the music box had found its way to her after all these years. It was no accident that the moment her tears touched the air, the song began again. The box wasn't simply a trinket from the past. It was a vessel, a portal that had opened a rift between the world of the living and the dead, drawing Evelyn into its depths. Her mother had known. She had known the danger. That's why she had kept the box hidden from Evelyn, perhaps even from herself. It wasn't meant to be opened. It had never been meant to be touched. Evelyn's fingers shook as she reached toward the reflection in the spinning music box. Her mother's face stared back at her, her expression now twisted with pain. But Evelyn was too far gone. She had opened the box, and now the past was spilling out, consuming her, swallowing her whole. She was no longer sure if she was living or dead, if this was all just a dream or a nightmare from which she couldn't escape. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The music stopped. The ballerina froze. The once vibrant room, filled with shadows and flickering candlelight, was now cold, empty, and silent. Evelyn stood alone in the dark, her heart thumping in her chest. Her mind raced with the remnants of what she had just seen, what she had felt. Was it real? Was her mother really speaking to her? Before she could even process the emptiness around her, there was a soft sound from behind her, an almost imperceptible movement. And then a voice. A whisper. "Evelyn, you shouldn't have opened it." Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. It was her own. She spun around, but no one was there. She could see nothing but the pitch-black shadows that seemed to stretch toward her like dark tendrils, pulling her into them. She screamed, but it was as if the room swallowed her voice. The silence was suffocating. Her hands fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. The shadows closed in tighter. In that moment, she understood. The music box had never belonged to her mother. It had belonged to Evelyn all along. And now, as she stood in the darkness, the music began again, soft at first, but growing louder, louder, until it was deafening. Her mother's face faded from the box, replaced by her own. Her eyes stared back at her, wide with terror. And Evelyn realized with sickening clarity she had never escaped. Story 2. David Kane sat at his writing desk, staring at the blank page before him. The hum of the overhead light was the only sound in the room, and it grated against the silence. He could feel the weight of the paper, cold, unyielding, as if mocking his inability to fill it. His fingers hovered over the pen, but no words came. Once, not long ago, he had been on top of the literary world. His books had fallen off the shelves, praised for their depth, their characters, and the way they made the ordinary feel terrifying. But lately, the words had stopped coming. It wasn't writer's block, or at least, that's what he told himself. No, it was something worse, something more insidious. A disconnection. An emptiness. He exhaled sharply, turning his wrist to stretch the cramps in his hand. He had been trying to force himself to write for hours now, but nothing had worked. He glanced around the room, the shadows of the evening creeping in from the corners. His study was a place of comfort, but tonight it felt like a cage. There was a restlessness in the air, thick and oppressive, like a storm just waiting to break. The ceiling fan creaked overhead, its slow spin providing a rhythm that only made the silence worse. David wiped his brow, feeling the faint sheen of sweat. He had never been afraid of the dark, but tonight it seemed to hold something unfamiliar. Something that made his skin crawl. He picked up his pen again, gripped it tighter, and pressed it to the paper. He didn't know what he was going to write, but he had to start somewhere. He couldn't just sit there, waiting for inspiration to strike. His mind wandered, and before he knew it, the pen began to move. The door creaked open, revealing a figure in the doorway. Its face was hidden in shadow, but there was something strange about the way it stood, still and waiting, as if it had been there for far longer than it should have. David blinked, surprised at how easily the words had come. The figure was vague. He hadn't meant to describe it this way, but there it was, taking shape on the page. The silence in the room deepened as his hand moved faster, the words flowing almost of their own accord. The figure took a step forward. Its footsteps were barely audible, like whispers on the air, but they were real, too real. Each step seemed to echo in the quiet, and David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. David stopped, his heart pounding suddenly. He hadn't meant to write that. He hadn't meant to describe the footsteps, the way they echoed. It was as if he could hear them now, too, though he was sure the house was empty. His breath quickened, and his grip tightened on the pen. The shadows seemed to move. He stood up and walked to the window, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, right? David stood by the window for several minutes, his hands pressed against the cold glass. The view was comforting, his quiet suburban neighborhood, the streetlights casting soft pools of yellow light along the road. But as he stared into the night, something felt off. It wasn't the view itself, but rather the way his mind had latched onto the image of the figure in the doorway. The figure wasn't just a product of his imagination. He could feel it. He could feel its presence, hovering just beyond the words he had written, as if it were waiting for him to finish the story. Shaking his head, he tried to push the thought away. It was nonsense. A character. A figment of his imagination. But as he turned back to his desk, his eyes caught something that made his stomach drop. The door to the study, his study, was slightly ajar. Just a crack, enough for a sliver of the hallway light to spill into the room. David froze. He had been certain he had closed it before sitting down to write. In fact, he always made sure the door was shut, his routine, his safe space. He took a step toward the door, heart racing. The silence felt suffocating now. The house seemed too quiet. His mind was playing tricks on him, he knew it. But the door, he had closed it. He was sure of it. With a trembling hand, he reached for the knob and pushed the door open. Empty. He let out a breath, trying to calm his nerves. Nothing was there. The hallway was dark and still. But still, the unease lingered. It was as though something was just on the other side of the door, waiting. Watching. David returned to his desk, his hand hovering over the paper once more. The pen felt heavier now, as if it carried more weight than just ink. There was a creeping sense of responsibility that gnawed at him, an unspoken warning. The figure in the doorway, was it just a character? Or was it something more? Had he somehow brought it to life with his words? The very thought made his stomach churn. No, it couldn't be true. He had written countless stories over the years. He had never once had a character step off the page. It was impossible. And yet, the ink on the page seemed darker now, more intense. David's eyes were drawn to the words he had written, and as he read them again, he felt a coldness settle in his chest. The figure was no longer just a figment of his imagination. It had shape. It had substance. And it was waiting for him to continue. To finish. David's fingers gripped the pen tightly, unwilling to let go. His thoughts scrambled, the need to write overwhelming his sense of reason. He stared at the page, and in the silence of his study, he heard the faintest whisper, the faintest hint of something, someone moving. A draft swept across the room, stirring the pages of his manuscript. He looked up, his pulse pounding in his ears, and for a moment, just a brief moment, he thought he saw it. The figure. Standing in the doorway of the study, eyes gleaming from the shadows. The shadows were alive. The air felt thick with something unspoken. The figure was waiting for him to write the next line. David stared at the page, his hands trembling. He hadn't written a word in what felt like hours, yet the words from earlier, those haunting lines, were still there, frozen in ink. He could feel the weight of them pressing on his mind, like a thick fog clouding his thoughts. He had imagined it, surely. The figure, whatever it was, couldn't be real. He was just tired, stressed from the lack of progress on his latest novel. It was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. But there was an unsettling certainty in the air that made his skin crawl. With a shaky breath, David grabbed the pen again. He had to push through it. His fingers hesitated before they touched the paper, but then they moved of their own accord, scribbling something down, a thought unbidden. The figure stepped into the room, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. A presence so strong it seemed to distort the very air, pulling the shadows closer. David felt the words leave his pen as if they were being dictated to him by an unseen force. He couldn't stop writing. It was like his hand was no longer in his control. It was as if something else was using him, twisting his own thoughts into a dark, unfamiliar narrative. A sharp, unsettling sound pierced the air, a knock. It came from the study door, loud and deliberate, as though someone was waiting for him to answer. David's heart lurched in his chest, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't move. He couldn't. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Louder. Something inside him snapped, and David found himself standing, his legs moving of their own accord. He approached the door slowly, every step dragging him closer to whatever waited on the other side. The room felt colder now, the silence broken only by the pounding of his own heartbeat. He reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. He could almost feel the pressure of the figure on the other side, its presence waiting to step into the room with him. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway. David closed the door with a quiet click, the room feeling strangely smaller now. His pulse was racing, the sense of dread that had settled into the room only intensifying. He needed to calm down. It was all in his head. He turned back to the desk, hoping to regain some semblance of control over his own mind. But as his eyes fell on the paper again, something caught his attention. The words he had written earlier, they were changing. Slowly, imperceptibly, but changing all the same. He leaned closer, his heart hammering as he saw it. The figure's description had shifted. The glowing eyes had become sharper, more focused. The air wasn't just distorted anymore, it was suffocating. He felt a shiver run down his spine. David glanced over his shoulder nervously, but there was no sign of the figure, no movement in the shadows. Yet, the sense of it, that presence, was still there. It was growing, becoming more real with each word he wrote. His hands began to shake again, but this time, he couldn't stop. He was drawn to the paper like a moth to a flame. The figure was waiting. It was watching him. Before he could stop himself, he began to write again. His fingers moved faster now, as if the pen had a life of its own, as if something else was pulling the strings. The figure moved toward David, its footsteps silent as it glided through the room. The air grew thick with tension, its eyes glowing brighter. It reached for him, its hand cold and skeletal, as though it had been waiting to claim him for an eternity. David's breath hitched as he finished the sentence. The words were still on the page, but they felt too real, too sharp, too familiar. The air around him had changed, had thickened. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, could almost hear the soft, calculated shuffle of footsteps behind him. A noise, distant but growing closer. The sound of something, someone moving. David stood up from his chair, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His eyes darted nervously around the room. The lights above him flickered. The walls felt like they were closing in. His fingers twitched, still holding the pen, but it felt like they weren't his own. Then, for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the doorway of the study. He blinked, and it was gone. But the presence remained. He could feel it in the room with him. David sank into the chair, his body heavy and his mind racing. The figure was real. He had written it into existence, and now it was coming for him. But how? How could this happen? How could words on a page take on such power? He looked down at the paper again, the writing now completely different from before. The figure had moved closer in the words, its hand almost touching David. Its eyes were glowing brighter now, almost pulsing. The door opened without a sound. David's breath caught in his throat. He didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. But the whisper came again, the voice like a low murmur just behind him. He knew the voice. It was his own. His hand lifted of its own accord, the pen scratching the paper again, the words flowing faster, without control. The figure spoke to David in a voice that seemed both familiar and alien. "You summoned me," it said, "and now you will pay the price." The whisper was real now, echoing in his ears. The cold hand, the skeletal touch, it was all too real. He could feel it pressing against his shoulder, just at the edge of his awareness. The hairs on his neck stood on end as he struggled to turn, to confront whatever was behind him. But he couldn't. His muscles locked. He was paralyzed. David tried to speak, but no words came. He reached for the paper again, the pen dancing across the page as if it was possessed, as if it was writing his fate for him. David felt trapped. The pen in his hand had become like an extension of his body, its weight unbearable, its power overwhelming. He couldn't stop writing. He couldn't stop the words from coming out. Every time he tried to pause, to breathe, the pen moved faster, dragging his hand across the page, forcing him into the story. The presence behind him was growing stronger. He could feel it in the room with him, as though the figure was waiting for him to finish writing, waiting for him to bring it fully into existence. The figure stood behind David, its breath cold and heavy against the back of his neck. It spoke again, its voice a rasping whisper in his ear. "You cannot stop it now. You have written your own fate." David's fingers shook as he finished the sentence. The words were dripping with foreboding. They felt as though they were no longer just fiction but a prophecy. The figure was coming for him. He could feel it. The shadows seemed to darken further, as though the room itself were bending to the will of his writing. The walls pressed in, and the temperature dropped, the air thick with the weight of something that didn't belong. David's heart raced, his mind struggling to break free from the hold the words had on him. His thoughts became a blur. The air was suffocating. He needed to stop. He had to stop, but the pen wouldn't obey. His hand kept moving. David tried to pull away, but the figure's hand clamped down on his shoulder, cold fingers digging into his flesh. His body screamed to escape, but it was as if the very world around him had become a prison. David gasped, feeling the coldness of the figure's touch even though it was still only on the page. He shook his head violently, trying to wake himself from the nightmare he had woven. The room seemed to bend, the shadows shifting, almost alive with movement. The figure was real. It was coming. The air was so thick now that David could barely breathe. His body was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving with every shallow breath. The pen in his hand felt like a living thing, twisting his wrist and forcing him to write as though his will had no control over it. His fingers bled from the grip, but he couldn't let go. He couldn't stop. His mind raced with fear. What had he done? How had he given life to something so dark? Something so hungry? He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for any sign of escape, but all he saw was the shadow stretching across the floor, growing darker and larger. The figure's voice echoed through the room, a low growl that sent shivers down David's spine. You've given me life, David. Now you must give me your soul. The words were there on the page. He had written them. He had brought this thing to life. The figure was real now, or at least as real as the air that he was gasping for. David could feel its presence closing in on him, just behind him, standing at the edge of the doorway, waiting for him to turn around. He could hear the shuffle of its feet across the floor. Slow. Calculated. Its eyes glowing in the darkness, its breath cold against the back of his neck. David tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat closed in on itself, choked by terror, suffocated by the weight of his own creation. The figure reached out again, its fingers brushing against his shoulder. It felt like ice, sharp, biting, the kind of cold that made his bones ache. David's mind spun, his thoughts fractured as he struggled to break free from the pen's grip. The room felt as though it was bending under the weight of the figure, the very fabric of reality twisting and warping with each word he wrote. He didn't know how much longer he could take it. His body was betraying him, his limbs locked in place, his eyes fixed on the paper, unable to stop the flow of words that poured from his hand. He had created this nightmare, and now he was trapped in it. The room seemed to spin faster. The figure was no longer just a shadow at the doorway. It had crossed into the room, its body shifting in and out of focus, like a mirage that was both here and not here. David's senses were overwhelmed. He could feel the cold of the figure's breath on his skin, smell its rotting, putrid stench, the air thick with decay. David felt the darkness swallow him whole. The figure was upon him now, its hand gripping his wrist, pulling him closer. He could see its eyes, glowing and empty, like two holes in the fabric of existence. The figure's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth, its voice a rasping hiss. David's pen moved again, writing out the next line, but this time it wasn't his hand. It wasn't his mind. The words were coming from somewhere else. He could feel it, like a shadow pulling at the very core of his soul. His eyes locked onto the page one final time, and the words jumped off the page, wrapping themselves around his throat like a noose. The darkness was all-encompassing now. The room was no longer a room. It was a void, a place where reality no longer had a grip. The figure stood before David, towering over him, its form twisted and warped as if it were made of shadow and nightmare. Its eyes burned through him, hollow and unblinking. David could no longer feel his own body. He was floating in a cold, infinite space, his breath frozen in his chest. Right the final line, the figure hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers. Finish it, David. Complete the story. David could barely think. His mind was a broken mirror, shards of thoughts scattered across the floor. The pen was still in his hand, the pressure of it so strong he couldn't even feel his fingers anymore. The ink dripped from the tip, a thick, dark stream that splattered across the page. He could feel the weight of the words. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't want to. His mind screamed for him to stop, but the figure was pulling at him, bending his will, twisting his fate. "Write it," the figure demanded, stepping closer. David's hand moved of its own accord. The pen slid across the page. The figure loomed over him, its breath hot against his skin. And then, the final words were written. The figure closed in on David, its cold fingers wrapping around his neck, squeezing until the darkness consumed him, until he was nothing more than ink on paper. David's body went limp. His mind was a whirlwind of fractured thoughts, each one colliding with the next in a frenzy of panic and confusion. His fingers continued to move the pen, but it wasn't him anymore. It wasn't his will guiding the strokes of ink across the page. He was just a vessel, a puppet being manipulated by something darker, something more ancient than he could comprehend. The figure loomed above him, its shape flickering in and out of the shadows like a mirage, something both solid and ephemeral. Its eyes, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room, bore into him. Its cold fingers tightened around his throat, and David's breath caught, his lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come. "You've written your end," the figure whispered, its voice slithering through the air, a sound like dead leaves scraping against stone. "But your story is far from over. The ending you wrote is mine now." David's vision blurred as the figure's grip tightened. He tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. His chest constricted as though it were being crushed under a mountain, the weight of his creation too heavy to bear. He could feel it now, the horror that he had brought to life. It wasn't just the figure that was real. It was everything. The room around him, the shadows that stretched like tendrils into the corners, the ink on the page, everything he had written, everything he had made with his own hand was turning against him. The very fabric of his existence was unraveling, and the more he struggled, the more the darkness consumed him. In the madness, a strange clarity began to form in David's mind. He saw the truth hidden beneath the layers of terror. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't some story he had written. It was something far worse, something far more dangerous. David had never understood the true nature of his power. He had thought it was a gift, a way to craft worlds, to create characters and plots that would captivate readers. But he had been wrong. His writing didn't just shape stories, it shaped reality itself. Every word, every sentence, every detail he had ever written had bled into the real world, slowly warping it, twisting it until nothing was left but a pale reflection of what it once was. The room around him began to blur again, the shadows stretching unnaturally, the walls cracking and shifting. He could hear the whispers of the figure, but they no longer made sense. They were echoes, fragments of sentences that didn't belong in this world, that didn't belong anywhere. His mind grasped at these fragments, trying to make sense of the horror he had unleashed. The figure closed in on David, he wrote, unable to stop himself. The pen moved faster now, as if it were racing to complete the story. "No!" David screamed internally. "I have to stop." But his body betrayed him. His hand moved of its own accord, the ink splattering onto the page, each drop a promise of something more, a deeper, darker part of the nightmare he had created. The figure was growing stronger now, its form becoming more distinct, more real. David could feel its presence in his bones, its coldness seeping into his skin, filling his veins with ice. Its hand moved to his chest, pushing him down, forcing him to watch as the ink bled onto the page, staining the paper with the final sentence. And then, with one last stroke, David wrote the end. The figure grinned, its teeth sharp and jagged like broken glass. The story is over, David. But for you, it has just begun. David felt his world crumble. The final word had been written, but it wasn't the end. Not for him. The words had become real, too real. His body trembled as the figure's shadow stretched across the floor, a dark, twisting form that seemed to consume everything in its path. The room, the walls, the air, it was all being absorbed into the blackness, into the story he had written. The figure leaned closer, its mouth inches from his ear. David could feel its cold breath against his skin, could smell the rotting stench that emanated from its form. It was no longer just a creation, it was his reality. You thought you could control it, David, the figure whispered, its voice like a funeral dirge. But you are nothing but ink on paper. A story. A word. A sentence. You are part of the story now, David. And it will never end. David's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was slipping away, drowning in a sea of words and images, drowning in the story he had written. The figure's hand tightened around his neck, squeezing until everything went black. When David awoke, he wasn't sure where he was. The air was thick, suffocating. His body felt numb, like he had been lying in one position for hours, days, years. His fingers were still wrapped around the pen, the ink on the page still fresh and wet. The room was silent, but there was something wrong. The walls seemed closer, the air colder. And then he saw it, the figure, standing in the corner of the room, watching him with those dark, hollow eyes. It hadn't gone anywhere. It was still here, still alive. David tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. His mind screamed at him, urging him to run, to escape, but his limbs refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, its form growing more solid, more real with every movement. No, David whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. I didn't mean it. I didn't want this. But it didn't matter. The words were written, and they had become truth. Reality had been rewritten, and now it was the figure's turn to be the author. You are mine now, the figure said, its voice a low, mocking growl. Your fate is sealed, David. There is no escape. And with that, the darkness swallowed him whole. Story 3. Darren Scott had always believed in the power of images. As a journalist, his job was to capture the world through the lens, to find the truth in moments frozen in time. But recently, something had been changing. His camera, once a trusted tool, had begun to betray him in ways he couldn't understand. It started innocuously enough, just a flicker in a photograph. A shadow in the corner of a room, barely noticeable at first. He chalked it up to a trick of the light, a blur from an unsteady hand. But the shadows began to grow, always in the background, always just out of focus. He thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, an overworked journalist looking for something more to grasp. But when Darren opened the photos one night on his laptop, he froze. The shadow had shape, form. And it wasn't just one shadow, it was many. Each photograph contained something different. A pale face in a kitchen window. A figure standing behind a couple at a wedding. A woman, her face gaunt, eyes hollow, standing at the foot of a staircase. Darren's stomach twisted. He zoomed in on the images, each one more unsettling than the last. These were no tricks of the light. They were faces, people, or something that looked like people, hiding just beyond the edge of reality. In every frame, they were there, watching him. It had been days since Darren first noticed the strange figures. He had done everything he could think of to explain them away, adjusting the lighting, changing the camera settings, cleaning the lens. But nothing worked. The ghostly figures only grew more persistent, more defined. He couldn't let it go. There was something in him, some relentless part of his journalist mind, that demanded answers. He couldn't just walk away from this, no matter how unnerving it was. The idea that something supernatural had begun to creep into his work was both horrifying and captivating. Darren knew he couldn't stop now. If this was a story, it was the one he had been searching for his whole career. The next morning, he went back to the same locations. A local library, an old, abandoned warehouse, an antique shop on the corner of Willow and Fifth, places where nothing seemed unusual, where the air was thick with dust and the past. He snapped photos, every frame an attempt to catch the elusive figures again, to capture proof of whatever had invaded his world. Each click of the camera was a fresh gamble. Would he catch the ghosts again? Or had they finally retreated? As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the town in long shadows, Darren went home to review the photos. The moment Darren opened the file, he felt the cold creep up his spine. This time, the figures were clearer, more pronounced. And they were not just in the background anymore. They were in the frames, standing beside him, walking through doorways, their pale faces grinning at him from the other side of the lens. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as he scrolled through the images. There, standing in front of an old wooden door, was the same figure he had seen in the previous photos, a woman with long black hair, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow, almost empty. But this time, her mouth was open, as if she were screaming. Darren leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. The image didn't make sense. There was something wrong with it, something wrong with her. The image zoomed in, focusing on her face. Darren's fingers trembled as he swiped the mouse to increase the brightness, and there, just at the edge of her mouth, was the faintest whisper of words. The image had captured more than just her expression, it had captured something else. Leave, now, before it's too late. The words weren't his. They weren't even from the camera. They were etched in the image itself, a subtle, impossible addition that chilled him to the bone. Darren's head spun. He had been alone when he took the photo. No one had been there except him, just the camera and his own thoughts. But now, the image was telling him something else. A warning. Was the camera somehow writing these words? The haunting message stayed with him for hours. It was as though the words had lodged themselves in his mind, replaying over and over in the back of his thoughts. The warning echoed like the pulse of some dark force he didn't understand. At first, Darren considered deleting the photos, erasing the evidence of what had appeared in them. But the journalist in him could not let go. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something larger, something that needed to be explored. If he could just figure out what was happening, maybe he could control it. Maybe he could expose whatever dark force was using his camera to torment him. But then, As the evening crept into night, Darren received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Scott?" The voice on the other end was low, a whispering rasp. "I see you're starting to understand." His heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" There was no reply, just the soft, distant sound of breathing, as if someone was standing just outside the door, watching him. The line went dead. From that night on, Darren became consumed with his photos. He couldn't look away. He spent every waking hour behind the lens, traveling to every corner of the city, searching for answers. Each new image he captured revealed something worse: more figures, more faces, more whispers. And the figures began to move. They shifted in the photographs, distorted by time and light, but they were not stationary anymore. They seemed to watch him as he clicked, following him wherever he went. As Darren walked through the streets at night, he could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their presence behind him, just out of sight. His mind began to fray. The line between reality and the photographs blurred. Was the world around him real, or was it part of the story unfolding in his camera? Was the woman in the photo still there, standing behind him, her eyes locked on his every move? The warnings in the photos grew louder, more urgent. Each image seemed to scream at him to stop, to run, to escape. But Darren couldn't. He was trapped, bound to the lens and the shadows it revealed. And the more he searched, the more the ghosts seemed to invade his world. Darren barely slept anymore. The days blurred into one long, unbroken stretch of paranoia, the nights filled with the eerie, distorted faces that haunted every image he captured. He tried to focus on his work, his writing, but the words wouldn't come. Every time he picked up the pen, his thoughts drifted back to the photographs. The faces. The whispers. He had tried calling his editor, explaining the strange phenomenon, but the words wouldn't leave his lips. Who would believe him? Who would understand that his camera had become a portal to something darker? The feeling that the world he had once known was beginning to slip through his fingers was a constant weight on his chest. He was no longer just a journalist, he was the subject of a horror story that he couldn't escape. That afternoon, Darren found himself at a small, dilapidated antique shop on the outskirts of town. His mind was racing, and his feet had carried him there without thinking. The shop was a treasure trove of old knickknacks and forgotten relics, but it was the dusty photographs on the back wall that caught his attention. As he wandered through the cluttered aisles, the low hum of the old fluorescent lights above his head seemed to distort, buzzing with an unnatural intensity. Darren's fingers brushed against the photos, flipping through them one by one. Each image was faded, worn with age, but there was something strangely familiar about the faces in the frames. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it, the same woman. The one with the gaunt face and hollow eyes. She was standing in the background of a wedding photo, staring at the camera with a knowing, predatory gaze. And just behind her, in the shadows, a shadowy figure lurked, just like the ones in his own photographs. Darren's hand trembled as he lifted the photo closer to his face. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a haunting he had captured. This woman had existed before. The shopkeeper, an old man with silver hair and thick spectacles, shuffled over to Darren as he stared at the photo. "You found her," the old man said in a raspy voice, his eyes dark under the weight of years. "It's her, all right. She's always been there." Darren turned to face him, his voice barely a whisper. Who is she? What's going on with these photographs? Why are these faces showing up in my pictures? The old man studied him for a long moment as though weighing the decision to speak. Finally, he sighed and gestured for Darren to follow him behind the counter. The back room was small, cluttered with more old photographs and boxes of forgotten memorabilia, but Darren's attention was focused entirely on the man. Her name's Lydia, the old man said, his voice quiet. She was a photographer once. She had a gift, like you. But her gift, it wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. Darren swallowed hard. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want to know, but some force, some part of him, drove him to listen. The old man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. She had the ability to make things real. Whatever she photographed, whatever she captured on film, became part of the world around her. At first, it was harmless, just little things. People's dreams, memories, wishes. But then it began to change. She started to photograph things that didn't exist, things that weren't supposed to be. And those things, they began to live. Darren's stomach churned. Are you saying that whatever I photograph, whatever I see in the pictures, it happens? The old man nodded slowly. Yes. And Lydia, she got lost in it. She started photographing things she shouldn't have, monsters, ghosts, things that weren't human. She thought she could control it, like you do. She thought it was just a matter of capturing the right shot. But she couldn't stop them. The more she took, the worse it became. The faces in the photos, they came to life. And they followed her. Darren felt a shiver run down his spine. He thought about the faces in his own photos, the woman with the hollow eyes, the shadows that had started to move, whispering words of warning. He thought about the way they seemed to know him, the way they were always there, waiting just out of sight. Where is she now? Darren asked, his voice trembling. The old man's gaze darkened. She's gone. But she's still here, in a way. Trapped in the photographs. And now, it's your turn. Darren's heart pounded in his chest. He backed away from the old man, the weight of the room pressing on him. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick with a strange, oppressive energy. He turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, the old man's voice stopped him. You have to destroy the camera, he said, his tone urgent. If you don't, the ghosts will keep coming. They'll follow you, feed off your fear. It's already started. You've seen it. You felt it. But you can still stop it. Darren's head was spinning. The old man's words echoed in his mind, bouncing around like a cage, and yet something deep inside him refused to let go. The journalist in him, stubborn, relentless, wanted to know more. He needed to know what was real and what was just a story. I can't destroy it, Darren said, turning back to the old man. I need to understand. I need to know what this is. The old man's face softened, and for a brief moment, Darren saw something like pity in his eyes. Then you'll understand soon enough, he said. But it will cost you more than you can imagine. Darren left the shop in a daze, the weight of the camera heavy in his hands. The warning was clear, but so was the lure. The faces in the photographs were only growing stronger, more vivid. They were waiting for him, always watching, always there. As Darren walked through the quiet streets, the feeling of being watched intensified. He glanced over his shoulder, certain that someone, or something, was behind him. But when he turned, there was only darkness. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far darker than he had ever anticipated. His thoughts churned as he walked back to his apartment, the heavy weight of the camera in his hand a constant reminder of the horror he had stumbled upon. He had to know the truth, didn't he? He had to understand what was happening, how it was happening. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was an obsession. The faces in his photographs, the shadows in the corners of the frames, seemed to call to him. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a challenge. If he could control this, understand it, then maybe, just maybe, he could stop it. But the nagging voice at the back of his mind told him that no one could control this. Not even Lydia, the photographer who had lost everything. The apartment felt colder than usual when Darren entered. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, and there was a palpable silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Darren sat at his desk, the camera still in his hands. He hadn't even bothered to unpack his gear from the day's shoot. There was no need. Nothing mattered now except the photographs. His fingers hovered over the shutter button. He couldn't stop himself. Something urged him forward, an insatiable hunger to see what would happen next. What would the camera show him this time? The question was haunting him. His hands were clammy as he raised the camera to his eye and clicked the shutter. The instant the flash illuminated the room, he felt it, something was wrong. His pulse quickened, and the air grew thick with tension. He pulled the camera away from his face, his breath shallow. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as if it, too, knew what was coming. When Darren glanced at the screen on the back of the camera, his stomach dropped. There it was again. A face. Not just any face. It was the same woman he had seen in the antique shop photo, the one with the hollow eyes. But now, she was closer. She was standing in his living room, her figure faint but unmistakable. He could see her expression clearly, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with an unsettling sense of recognition. And behind her, barely visible, something else, a shadowed figure, tall and formless, just as he had seen in the other photos. Darren's throat went dry. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, a thundering, rhythmic pulse that drowned out everything else. He didn't want to look again, but something forced him to. He had to know more. He had to understand. When he took another picture, the same woman appeared, but this time, she was closer. Much closer. She was standing just behind him. Darren snapped another photo, his hands trembling, but this time, the image on the screen was different. The woman was no longer just a specter in the background. She was there, in his apartment. In the photo, her figure had come to life. She was standing directly behind Darren, her eyes wide with something like recognition or perhaps malice. The air around him turned cold, and Darren's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. The camera's lens captured the distorted image of the woman, but something else was present now, something darker. A faint, distorted shadow flickered at the edges of the frame, as if the camera couldn't fully capture the horror of what was happening. Darren felt a cold breath against the back of his neck. He turned quickly, but there was nothing. His apartment was empty, silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but his mind was racing. This was real. The woman. The shadows. The thing that had followed him from the photographs to his very own home. He turned back to the camera, and the whispering began. The soft, barely audible sound started as a murmur, like the rustling of dry leaves. It grew louder, more insistent, until Darren could make out words. The voice was distorted, like someone speaking underwater, but the message was unmistakable. "Help me." Darren's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. The voice was coming from the woman in the photograph. The one who had followed him from the antique shop, from the forgotten images of Lydia. She was trying to communicate with him, begging him for help. Darren dropped the camera in shock, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing in the otherwise silent room. The whispering continued, now louder, clearer, more urgent. "Help me, before they take you too." He picked the camera up again, his hand shaking. He couldn't stop himself. There was no way out now. The camera was a curse, but it was the only way to understand what was happening. It was the only way to make sense of the nightmare. He had to keep taking pictures. He had to find out more. Another click. Another flash. The woman was standing right in front of him this time, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. Her hand reached out from the photograph, her fingers twisting in a grotesque, unnatural way. The shadow behind her was growing, stretching like a living thing. It was no longer just a figure in the background. It was closing in, swallowing the light, drawing nearer with every flash of the camera. Darren's pulse raced. The world around him seemed to fade, becoming a distorted blur. The walls of the apartment seemed to stretch and distort, the light flickering like a malfunctioning bulb. The shadows grew longer, and the whispers turned into something else, something darker. It was no longer just a woman's voice. It was a chorus of voices, muffled and indistinct, but unmistakably real. "Help me. You're too late. They're coming." The words cut through him like a knife, and Darren felt his sanity begin to unravel. He was no longer in control. The camera had become an instrument of torment, a portal to something beyond the physical world. And every time he clicked the shutter, the boundaries between the two realms seemed to blur more and more. His mind raced as the faces of the past filled his thoughts. Lydia. The woman in the photo. The shadowy figure. Were they all connected? Had this cursed ability passed from Lydia to him? Was he now bound to the same fate? The whispers were now deafening. The room was suffocating, the walls pressing in as Darren struggled to breathe. He staggered backward, his vision growing dark, his mind gripped by an overwhelming sense of doom. The woman in the photograph had stepped out of the frame entirely. She was now standing in front of him, her fingers outstretched, her face twisted with terror and hunger. Behind her, the shadow was taking shape, a monstrous presence that was slowly consuming the light. Darren snapped another photo, but this time, he could no longer see the woman. All he saw was a blur, a swirl of darkness, a vortex of night. The shadows had swallowed her whole. They were coming for him, too. The camera's screen went black. Darren's heart pounded as he realized he could no longer see the images. The camera had stopped working. The whispers ceased. The room fell into an eerie silence, and for a moment, Darren thought he had escaped. But then the door to his apartment slammed shut. The lights flickered and died. And from the darkness came the first whisper. The darkness was absolute. Darren's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he stumbled backward, his hands frantically searching for anything to steady himself. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls shrinking, the ceiling lowering. The air was thick, suffocating, and as the darkness engulfed him, the whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices clamoring for his attention. Help me, you must understand. Darren's eyes strained to adjust to the total lack of light, but nothing could pierce the overwhelming blackness. Every sound seemed magnified, his heartbeat, his ragged breaths, the rustling of his clothes as he moved, but most of all, the whispers. They were no longer just distant voices or mere murmurs. They felt like they were inside his head, rattling his skull, digging into his very thoughts. You've seen too much, Darren. There's no turning back. The camera in his hands, the very object that had driven him to this point, felt heavier than ever. It was no longer just a tool, it was a portal, a conduit to something far worse than he could have ever imagined. Each click had drawn him deeper into the abyss. And now, it felt like that abyss was swallowing him whole. He had to see. He had to know. The compulsion was stronger than ever. If he could just take one more photograph, maybe, just maybe, he could understand what was happening to him, to this cursed world he had entered. But the camera didn't work. It was black, lifeless in his trembling hands. He clicked the shutter again and again, but there was nothing. The room stayed dark, the whispers growing louder, pressing against him like invisible hands. And then, a voice broke through the chaos, its tone clear and sharp, filled with an unnatural sense of finality. It's too late, Darren. The lens has already taken you. Darren froze. He knew that voice. It was Lydia's voice, the woman whose face had first appeared in his photographs. The same woman who had warned him, the same woman whose fate had seemed sealed in those cursed photos. But how could this be happening? Lydia was gone, her body lying in an unmarked grave, her life swallowed by the very curse she had warned him about. Yet here she was, speaking to him from the darkness. You thought you could escape, the voice continued, now sounding distant, fading in and out like an old recording. But the camera doesn't let you go. It binds you to the images you capture. Every frame, every photograph, they trap pieces of your soul. You've taken too many, Darren. You've crossed the line. Darren's head spun, and for a moment, the room seemed to twist and shift. The walls bent, the shadows warping into grotesque shapes. He staggered, his feet faltering as the ground seemed to undulate beneath him, as if the very floor was alive. His mind was reeling, struggling to make sense of the madness that surrounded him. There is no escape, Lydia's voice whispered again, now more desperate, more pleading. Once the camera sees you, it doesn't let go. It doesn't release you. It consumes you. Darren's hands shook violently as he lifted the camera again, his mind torn between fear and an undeniable compulsion. He pressed the shutter. There was no flash this time, no blinding light, no sudden reveal. Just the quiet click of the camera's shutter. And yet, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped several degrees, and the shadows seemed to deepen. The whispering voices became deafening. This time, Darren didn't even want to look at the screen. He knew what he would see. He had seen it before. The woman, the shadow, the faces, the darkness. It had become a cycle, a never-ending loop of terror, and each photograph had drawn him further into the grip of something unnatural. But, as if possessed by something darker than fear, Darren looked anyway. The screen flickered to life, and the woman was there. But she was no longer just a figure in the background. She was front and center, standing in the frame as if she had stepped directly out of the lens itself. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now wide with an emotion that Darren could not name. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. And then, behind her, the shadow. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something far worse. It was a presence, a living, suffocating darkness that stretched across the room, devouring everything in its path. Darren could feel it, whatever it was, whatever had been brought into his world through the lens, it was real. The camera had somehow created it. And now it was coming for him. He stumbled back, his legs weak, his stomach twisting in knots. He had to get away. But there was nowhere to run. The walls pressed in on him, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. The whispers reached a crescendo, filling his head with a maddening chant. You are ours now. Forever. The last words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. The shadow behind the woman began to swell, an overwhelming presence that filled every inch of the room. And then, the woman's face twisted, contorting into something grotesque, her mouth opening impossibly wide as she let out a silent scream. Darren's breath caught in his throat as the world seemed to collapse around him. The room was no longer his apartment. It was a place of nightmares, a void where light and sound had no meaning. The camera, now glowing with an eerie light, seemed to pulse with life, its lens turning toward him as though it too had become sentient. Darren's mind teetered on the brink of insanity. He had no control. The camera had taken him, and there was no escape. He was part of the nightmare now, an unwilling participant in whatever dark reality the camera had unleashed. The woman's face appeared again, closer now, her eyes hollow, her lips stretched into a twisted grin. But this time, Darren didn't take another photo. He dropped the camera, the final snap of the shutter lingering in the air like a cursed echo. The camera's screen went black. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, as if the camera had drained him of his very essence, Darren felt the coldest sensation wash over him, an overwhelming, suffocating chill that seeped into his bones. The whispers were gone. The shadows, too, had faded. But the room was no longer his apartment. It was a dark, distorted version of it. The walls were twisted, the furniture broken and scattered, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. The ceiling had collapsed, the floor cracked open like a yawning chasm. And standing in the center of it all was the woman. Her hollow eyes locked onto his. She tilted her head, a sickening grin pulling at the corners of her mouth. The shadows behind her reached out like tendrils, their darkness suffocating the room, wrapping around him, pulling him closer. He had been trapped. The camera had taken him, just as it had taken Lydia before him. The last thing Darren saw before everything went dark was the flash of the camera. Then, nothing. And for the first time in ages, the whispers stopped. The camera had claimed its final victim. Story 4. The night was quiet, too quiet for August Klein, the lone worker who had been tending the cemetery for the past 10 years. The cemetery was tucked away in a forgotten corner of town, surrounded by an old iron fence and flanked by thick woods that seemed to swallow any sound. Klein knew the place like the back of his hand. The headstones were worn, some so old that their inscriptions had long faded into obscurity. The air was thick with the scent of earth, decay, and time. This was his domain now, and he took pride in keeping it orderly, though few ever came to visit. He usually worked late, finishing the day's tasks when the sun had set and the cemetery was wrapped in darkness. His hours had grown longer since his wife had passed away. The pain of her absence drove him to stay busy, to fill the silence with the rhythmic sound of his shovel against the dirt or the clink of his rake against the gravestones. It was a small comfort. But tonight, something felt wrong. It was around midnight when he first noticed a freshly dug grave. He hadn't been expecting it. There had been no call for a new burial. No one had died in the town recently. Klein wiped the sweat from his brow, even though the air had grown cold. He had come to the corner of the cemetery where the older plots lay, near the overgrown weeds. The earth was loose and disturbed, the soil displaced as if something, or someone, had recently been buried there. Yet no funeral had taken place. He checked the cemetery's records, but there was no entry for the plot. He stood there for a moment, his breath misting in the cool air, wondering if he had missed something, some small detail, some bit of paperwork he overlooked. But that didn't make sense. He was meticulous about his work. Klein walked around the new grave, his boots crunching against the gravel as he inspected it closely. It was fresh, too fresh. The edges of the hole were still soft, the dirt barely compacted, and the scent of disturbed earth was overwhelming. He felt his stomach turn, a chill creeping up his spine. There were no funeral arrangements for this grave. No one had asked for a plot. And yet, here it was. Klein knelt by the grave, his hand hovering above the soil. He had spent the better part of a decade working in this cemetery, and not once had he encountered anything like this. The unease that gnawed at him grew. Was it a prank? Perhaps some kids had come out here to dig for fun, but even that didn't explain why the grave was so perfectly formed, the edges so precise. It looked like a real burial site, one prepared by someone who knew what they were doing. His thoughts began to race, spiraling into darker possibilities. What if it wasn't a prank? What if something else was at work? He stood up, looking around the cemetery as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. A sound caught his attention, soft, almost imperceptible, but there. A whisper, barely audible, like a breath in the wind. He turned toward the far side of the cemetery, near the wrought iron gates. The dark expanse beyond seemed impenetrable, the trees heavy with the night's fog. Klein's skin prickled. He had never been particularly superstitious, but this feeling, this unease, gnawed at him. He had the distinct sense that he wasn't alone. A few minutes passed, and nothing came of it. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and the usual stillness of the cemetery returned. He shook his head and dismissed the thought. He was just tired, that's all. But as he moved to cover up the new grave, something caught his eye again, another one. The second grave was even fresher, and it was located on the other side of the cemetery, beside a row of family plots. His heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't noticed it earlier when he made his rounds, and yet here it was, as if it had materialized from thin air. Again, no funeral, no paperwork, no record, just a fresh grave. This time, Klein didn't bother checking the cemetery's records. The dread that washed over him wasn't easily ignored. He felt something in the air shift, something wrong, as if reality itself was bending. By morning, there were 3 more graves, each appearing in the dead of night, each one looking as though they had been carefully prepared and freshly dug. Klein was beside himself. He spent the next few hours in the small office of the cemetery, flipping through every record book, searching for some trace of any recent burials. But nothing added up. No one had died in the town. No new plot requests had been filed. He ran his fingers through his hair, his mind churning. The graves, they didn't just appear by accident. Someone was digging them where something else was. But who or what could do such a thing without anyone noticing? That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows grew long, Klein took it upon himself to stay overnight in the cemetery. He set up camp near the caretaker's shed, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding area. The evening air was thick, oppressive, the kind of silence that presses down on you like the weight of 1,000 years. The cemetery stretched before him, the tombstones lined up like silent sentinels. He tried to keep his thoughts focused, tried to ignore the eerie chill creeping over him, but he couldn't. Every creak of a tree branch, every rustle of the wind, every distant howl of a coyote set his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The first grave appeared as soon as the moon rose, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. This time, Klein didn't hesitate. He ran to the spot, his heart racing, his breath coming in gasps. The dirt was soft, freshly turned, and it seemed as though the earth itself had shifted overnight. He knelt by the edge, his hands trembling as he brushed the dirt aside. And that's when he saw it, something dark, something that didn't belong. A hand. A rotting, skeletal hand that had risen from the earth. Klein froze, staring at the skeletal hand, his mind reeling. It wasn't possible. This wasn't real. The earth should have been empty. There should have been no body, no hand. But the hand moved. It twitched, then slowly pulled itself free from the earth, revealing a figure half buried, its body covered in mud and decay. The thing's eyes were open, black as coal, and locked onto Klein's. The air thickened, heavy with a presence that threatened to consume him. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. The wind howled as the thing began to rise from the grave, its limbs jerking, its body shuddering. And then, with a sudden, unnatural movement, it lunged forward, its hand grasping at Klein's arm. Klein screamed, but no one was there to hear him. Klein stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the cold, decomposing hand of the figure clutched at his arm. The thing's grip was like ice, and it sent a wave of nausea through him. The smell of death, of old decay, filled his senses, drowning out everything else. The ground around him felt like it was shifting, the dirt soft and treacherous underfoot, as if it were alive, swallowing him whole. He ripped his arm free, his eyes wide with terror. His breath came in frantic gasps, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, to escape, but his legs felt as though they were frozen in place. The figure in the grave groaned, its hollow eyes never leaving Klein as it began to pull itself free, one slow movement at a time. The soil seemed to reluctantly let go of it, as if it were a part of the earth itself. "No, no," Klein muttered, his voice barely a whisper, his knees trembling. The grave was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The figure, its gaunt, skeletal form, and the strange, unholy energy surrounding it, it felt like something out of a nightmare, something impossible. But it was here, in front of him, its mouth now open in a grotesque mockery of a smile. His fingers fumbled for his phone, but it slipped from his hands as his knees buckled beneath him. The ground seemed to press up from below, as though it was trying to pull him into the earth, into the very grave from which the thing was emerging. "Help!" he finally managed to shout, though he knew no one would hear him. The cemetery was isolated. The nearest house was miles away. He was completely alone. The wind howled in response, like some malicious force mocking his helplessness. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but his body was too terrified to listen. The thing's hand reached up, its fingers curled in a grotesque fashion, its nails long and jagged like broken glass. It touched Klein's shoulder, and a violent chill coursed through his body. His skin crawled as the figure's rancid breath hit his face, like old, wet earth and rot. The creature's voice finally escaped its mouth, a dry, rasping sound that scraped at the edges of Klein's sanity. "You have seen me?" Klein's blood ran cold. His vision blurred. The world around him seemed to bend. The figure's words seemed to echo, repeating over and over, as if they were pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. Before Klein could react, the ground beneath him shifted again, and the creature lunged forward, its skeletal fingers locking around his throat. He gasped for air, but there was none to be had. The grip tightened, and everything went dark. When Klein finally regained consciousness, he was lying on the cold ground, his back aching, his breath ragged. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of earth and decay, but the figure was gone. The grave had returned to its undisturbed state, the soil smooth, the hand and the thing that had risen from it completely absent. It was as if nothing had happened. Klein struggled to sit up, his head spinning, his hands trembling. His pulse raced in his ears, and a sense of profound dread washed over him. What had happened? Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion or fear? But no! He knew what he had seen. It had been real. The figure. The grave. The touch of death itself. He stood shakily, wiping the dirt from his clothes. His hands were still cold, the memory of the touch searing into his skin like some foreign stain that wouldn't wash off. The cemetery was still and silent, the wind now quiet, as if it, too, were holding its breath. Klein felt a strange compulsion to look at the fresh grave once more, though every fiber of his being screamed for him to leave. When he reached the grave, he gasped. It was gone. Completely gone. The earth was smooth and untouched. There was no evidence of what had happened, no hole, no disheveled earth, no remains of the thing that had tried to claim him. The grave had vanished as if it had never existed. But Klein couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air had changed. The cemetery felt different, as if a presence lingered just beyond his vision. As if the land itself had absorbed something that would never leave. Days passed, but the unease that had settled in Klein's chest didn't go away. He tried to ignore it. tried to pretend that the cemetery was just a place like any other, that the strange events of that night had been nothing more than a figment of his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen something that shouldn't exist. Every evening, when he returned to work, Klein found himself drawn to that same spot, the place where the grave had appeared. His heart would race, his stomach would churn, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He had to find out what was going on. But when he arrived each night, the grave was gone. Just like before. No trace. Nothing. The feeling of being watched began to grow stronger, a presence lingering in the corners of his vision, just beyond his reach. He would hear whispers in the wind, soft and unintelligible, but always there. He started seeing shadows move between the graves when no one was there. He began to question his own sanity. Was it just exhaustion? Was he losing his mind? But the whispers became louder. They weren't just in the wind anymore. They were in his ears, in his thoughts, calling to him. You have seen us. You will see more. One night, as he walked the cemetery paths, a cold chill settled over him. The moon hung low, casting long, ghostly shadows across the graveyard. It was then that Klein heard it, footsteps, soft and measured, coming from behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat, but there was nothing there. And yet, the grave was back. This time, it was bigger, deeper, and it looked different. The dirt was piled high, as if something was trying to escape from beneath the earth. The grave seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though it were alive, calling to him. Klein knelt before it, drawn by an overwhelming compulsion. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes wide with terror. And that's when he saw it, a hand, rising slowly from the earth, blackened and decayed, followed by a figure, not skeletal this time, but full of rotting flesh. Welcome back, the voice whispered from the grave. The ground trembled beneath him. Klein's hands shook as he stared at the figure emerging from the grave. It was taller than before, with its body sagging under the weight of rot, its eyes black in voids that reflected no light. The smell was worse than anything Klein had ever experienced, worse than 100 forgotten cemeteries, worse than the worst nightmares his mind had ever concocted. The figure's face was featureless except for the eyes, which now locked with his, drawing him into something deep and terrible. It whispered again, a voice full of rot and ancient sorrow. You shouldn't have come back. Klein felt the words wash over him like a cold wave, washing away everything he thought he knew about reality. His legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground, trembling, unable to look away from the blackness in the figure's eyes. A heaviness hung in the air, an unnatural pressure that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. With every inch the figure crawled from the grave, the air thickened. The shadows around him seemed to stretch longer, curling and twisting in unnatural shapes as if they were alive, feeding off his fear. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out everything except the presence of the figure and its dark, infinite gaze. He wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't. His body was frozen in place, locked in the horror of the moment. He could hear his breath, sharp and ragged, but it felt distant, detached from his own body. I don't understand, Klein managed to whisper, his voice cracking. What is this? What are you? The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, its teeth yellowed and broken. I am what you've awakened, it said, its voice now deep and resonant, as though it were coming from somewhere far beyond the grave. And now, I am here to stay. Klein's eyes darted around, his mind desperately searching for a way out. His gaze fell on the freshly unearthed grave, the surrounding soil disturbed, as though something had been clawing its way out from underneath. The wind howled around him, but there was no escape from the suffocating presence of the figure, nor from the cold, clammy feeling that had settled in his bones. "You have disturbed the land," the figure continued, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The dead will rise again. And the grave that digs itself will take more than just your soul." The figure was now fully emerged from the grave, standing before Klein like some twisted reaper, its form barely human, its body more shadow than flesh. Klein could feel its malevolent energy seeping into the ground beneath him, the earth itself thrumming with life as though it had been waiting for this moment. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices now ringing in his head. "You shouldn't have dug too deep. Now you belong to us," they murmured, overlapping and indistinct, like 100 dead souls all vying for his attention at once. Klein stumbled to his feet, unable to stop himself from backing away, but every step he took felt like it was leading him into something darker, something worse. The cemetery around him was no longer a place of quiet death, but a twisted, sentient nightmare. The gravestones seemed to lean in toward him, their inscriptions now indecipherable, the names on the stones constantly changing, as though the earth itself was rewriting history. The wind was growing colder, colder than it had ever been before, biting into his skin. His breath came out in plumes of fog, visible in the dim moonlight. He could feel something watching him, from all angles, from the earth, from the air, from the shadows around him. The figure from the grave was gone, but its presence still hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating him. Then, without warning, he heard it, footsteps, soft and deliberate, crunching over the dead leaves scattered on the ground. He spun around, expecting to see the figure, creeping closer, but instead, there was a man standing at the edge of the cemetery. His clothes were tattered, his hair matted with grime, and his face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight. His eyes were hollow, dark sockets staring back at Klein with a sense of hopelessness, as though he had been here for far too long, trapped in the same nightmare. Klein's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happening?" The man's lips barely moved, but Klein heard him speak. "You should have left. You should have left when you had the chance." Before Klein could respond, the man turned and walked away, vanishing into the night, swallowed up by the cemetery. Klein's mind raced. Who was that? What did he mean? And more importantly, why was this happening? The next few days were a blur for Klein. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the figure from the grave reappeared in his dreams, clawing its way toward him, its black eyes following his every move. He started hearing whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder until they filled his mind constantly, like 1,000 voices screaming for attention. The whispers spoke of the cemetery, of the land beneath it, of an ancient curse that had been placed upon the graveyard long ago, before the first tombstone had even been set. It was a curse that had been forgotten by time, but not by the earth. The land had always been hungry, always waiting for the right moment to feed, and now it was awakening again. Klein tried to tell himself that it was just stress, that it was his mind unraveling under the pressure. But as the days went on, he could feel the truth creeping closer. He could feel the weight of it in his bones. Every grave he passed seemed to whisper to him, every shadow seemed to stretch out with unnatural life. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the cemetery itself was pressing in on him. That night, Klein finally couldn't take it anymore. He returned to the cemetery, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to confront it. He had to know what was happening. He walked through the rows of graves, each step feeling like it led him deeper into the abyss. When he reached the spot where the first grave had appeared, he paused, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The ground was disturbed again, the soil piled high in the same unnatural way as before. Klein stared at it, his heart beating faster. The whispers were louder now, close enough that he could almost hear them as clearly as his own thoughts. The figure appeared again, its skeletal form rising from the grave, its hollow eyes searching him out. "You've come," it rasped. "And now, the land will take you." Before Klein could scream, the earth beneath him cracked open, and the ground swallowed him whole. Klein awoke in darkness. His body was stiff, his arms and legs bound by the weight of something heavy, soil, earth, suffocating him from all sides. The last thing he remembered was the ground swallowing him, and now he was buried deep beneath the cemetery. He could feel the cool, damp earth pressing in around him, filling his nose with the musty, ancient smell of decay. His chest tightened in panic as he realized he couldn't move. The weight of the world was pressing down on him, and all he could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears. He opened his mouth to scream, but the dirt filled his throat, choking off the sound. Panic surged through him, his mind screaming for air, for release. It was as if the very land had claimed him, pulling him into its dark embrace. He tried to fight, to push against the soil, but his arms and legs felt weak, as though they were no longer his own. Then, through the suffocating silence, he heard it, the whispers again, louder now, reverberating inside his skull. They were close. He could feel them all around him, their presence crawling over his skin, brushing against him like cold fingers. "Welcome to your final resting place." The voice was familiar now, the same one that had whispered to him in the cemetery, the one that had called him back. But now, it was more than just a voice. It was the earth itself speaking, its ancient, hollow tone full of malice and hunger. The land had been waiting for him, feeding off his fear, his confusion. Klein struggled to keep his mind intact as he listened to the voices grow louder, more insistent. It was as though they were all around him, buried deep in the soil, woven into the very fabric of the earth. They spoke of the past, of an ancient curse placed upon the land long ago, one that had been forgotten by time but never by the grave. They spoke of souls trapped here, bound to the land for eternity, their bodies consumed by the earth, their spirits wandering, waiting for the next victim. "You're part of it now," the voices whispered. "You'll never escape. Not while the land still hungers." Klein's breath became shallow as the whispers continued to drown out everything else. But then, amid the madness of his thoughts, something changed. The earth around him seemed to shift, to come alive. He felt the soil ripple, as though something beneath him was stirring, something ancient and powerful. And then, he saw them. Figures, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer, ghostly apparitions of people, faces twisted in agony, their bodies half-rotted and barely recognizable. They floated above the ground, their eyes fixed on Klein as they moved in slow, deliberate circles. Their movements were unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings, their mouths opening to speak words that Klein couldn't understand. But he could feel their sorrow. He could feel their anger, their frustration, and most of all, their hunger. "We were once like you," one of the figures said, its voice a low, gurgling rasp that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "We were once alive, once part of the world above. But we were taken by the curse of this land. And now, you're one of us." Klein's heart raced. "No," he gasped, struggling against the suffocating earth that still held him captive. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for any of this." "You didn't mean to," the figure replied, its eyes burning with a cold, dead fire. "None of us meant to. But the earth does not care for your intentions. It takes what it wants." The other figures gathered closer, their hollow eyes fixed on Klein with growing intensity. "You will join us," another figure whispered, its voice like the scraping of bones on stone. "You will become part of the land. You will never leave." The vision grew clearer, and Klein realized that the figures were not just ghosts, they were the souls of those who had been buried here, victims of the curse that had long plagued the cemetery. They were bound to the land, unable to escape, their bodies consumed by the earth, their spirits trapped in an eternal limbo. He tried to shut out their voices, to block out the overwhelming sensation that he was slipping away, but it was impossible. The land was too powerful, too old. It had consumed him, just as it had consumed countless others before him. As the vision faded and the spirits dispersed, Klein's mind began to fracture. His thoughts were no longer his own, they were being swallowed by the dark presence of the land, by the curse that had taken hold of him. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and he could feel his consciousness slipping away into the abyss. But then, something snapped. A sudden surge of adrenaline shot through him, and he fought against the encroaching darkness, forcing himself to focus. He had to escape. He couldn't let the earth claim him, couldn't let it take him the way it had taken all those who came before him. With every ounce of strength, Klein pushed against the soil, digging, clawing his way upward. The earth fought back, resisting, but Klein didn't stop. He could feel the weight of the land pressing on him, its cold fingers wrapping around his legs, pulling him back down into the grave. But he refused to let it win. He clawed harder, his hands raw and bleeding, his breath ragged and shallow. Every inch felt like an eternity, but finally, just as he thought he could go no further, he broke through. For the first time in days, Klein tasted fresh air, sweet, cool, and freeing. But as he looked around, his heart sank. The cemetery was the same, yet different. The tombstones were still there, the graves still marked by names he didn't recognize. The land was the same, but the feeling was wrong. He realized with a sinking dread that he hadn't escaped at all. The earth had let him rise, but it hadn't released him. He was still part of it. The curse was still alive within him. And that wasn't the worst of it. Klein turned around and saw the fresh grave behind him. The one that had dug itself. It was waiting for him. The air grew thick and suffocating, and the land seemed to twist itself around Klein's mind. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. The curse wasn't just confined to the cemetery. It had followed him. And now, he was part of it. The earth had consumed him, and there was no way to escape. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the whispers started again, louder this time. They were calling his name, urging him to join them, to accept his fate. But Klein wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. With every ounce of strength left in him, he turned and fled from the cemetery, running as fast as he could, desperate to escape the pull of the land. But no matter how far he ran, the grave that dug itself was always behind him, always waiting, always watching. Klein's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked over his shoulder, his eyes wild with fear. And then, he saw it. The figure from the grave, the one that had first spoken to him, was standing in the distance, watching him. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Klein understood the final truth. He had never been meant to escape. And now, neither would the earth. Story 5. Sophie had never liked the attic. It was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and the scent of forgotten memories. But today, she had no choice. She needed something, anything, to help with the article she was writing on family history. Her grandmother, who had recently passed, had always been a fond of old stories about their ancestors, but Sophie hadn't thought much of it until now. Now, with the funeral over and the house empty, it felt like the last piece of a puzzle needed to be put together. She hadn't expected to find what she did. The attic was cramped, with boxes piled high in every corner, and shelves groaning under the weight of old knickknacks and forgotten trinkets. There was a box of photographs near the center of the room, tucked into a dusty cardboard container marked Family Memories. Sophie's hands were shaking as she flipped through the thick stack of photos, each one capturing moments long past. Her ancestors in black and white images, her parents as children, her younger self at various birthdays and holidays. The usual stuff. The pictures were remarkable, except one. It was a picture of her grandparents standing outside their old house, the one that had been torn down decades ago. Sophie wasn't sure when the photo was taken, but her grandmother was holding her younger self in the picture. She looked younger than Sophie remembered, and her grandfather was there too, smiling proudly at the camera. But there was something wrong with the photo. A man stood behind them, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by a mask. At first, Sophie thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a prank from some distant relative. But as she stared at the figure, she felt a cold chill crawl down her spine. The man in the mask had an unsettling presence. His eyes were vacant and hollow, his posture too still, like he wasn't part of the photograph, but an intruder. Sophie frowned, her fingers trembling as she traced the edge of the photo with her nails. She didn't recognize him. No one in her family had ever mentioned a masked stranger in their stories. Sophie's curiosity was piqued, and a creeping sense of unease began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Sophie went downstairs, clutching the photograph in her hand. She found her father in the living room, sitting in his favorite chair, his eyes glued to the TV. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Dad," she said, sitting beside him on the couch. "Can I ask you something?" He turned to her, his face softening. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" Sophie hesitated, holding up the photograph. "I found this picture in Grandma's attic." "Do you know who this is?" she asked, pointing to the man with the mask. Her father's eyes flickered for a moment, and Sophie could swear she saw a fleeting shadow of fear in them before he quickly looked away. That's odd," he said, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "I don't know. It must be one of the neighbors, or maybe some friend of your grandparents. People used to dress up like that for fancy parties back in the day." Sophie narrowed her eyes. But why would someone be wearing a mask in the family picture? And why is he standing so close to Grandma and Grandpa? Her father stiffened, his smile faltering. I don't know. I don't remember anyone like that in the family. Maybe you should ask your aunt. She's the one who kept all of Grandma's old things. But Sophie wasn't convinced. There was something off about her father's reaction. He was usually so open with her, but now he seemed almost afraid. She couldn't explain it, but the more she looked at the photograph, the more unsettled she became. Dad, I'll ask Aunt Laura, she said, standing up. Thanks. As she walked to the phone, she felt her father's eyes on her, but when she turned to look, he was staring at the TV again, his face tense. Sophie called her Aunt Laura that evening, hoping for more answers. Laura had always been the family historian, the one who could recite the genealogy of every person in their family tree with incredible detail. She had a deep love for preserving the family's stories, so Sophie hoped that she would be able to shed some light on this mysterious man in the photograph. Hello? Laura's voice crackled through the receiver. Aunt Laura, it's Sophie. I found something weird in Grandma's old photographs. Do you know anything about a man in a mask? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A man in a mask? Sophie, where did you find this photograph? In Grandma's attic, Sophie explained, her voice tight. It's of her and Grandpa, but there's this man behind them wearing a mask. I don't recognize him. Do you? There was another long silence before Aunt Laura's voice returned, now strained, almost fearful. I need you to listen very carefully, Sophie, she said. That man. I've seen him before. In the old pictures, in the stories. I've seen him in the background, always just there. Never speaking. Never acknowledged. But always there. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean you've seen him before? How? Who is he? Sophie, Aunt Laura said, her voice trembling. There are things in our family history, things we don't talk about. Things we don't mention. I don't know who he is, but I know this. He's been following us. He's been in every major family event for generations, but no one ever remembers him being there. The words hung in the air, thick with dread. He's the masked stranger, Aunt Laura whispered. And he's never left us. Sophie's pulse quickened, her grip on the phone tightening. What do you mean he's never left us? What does that mean? I don't know exactly, Aunt Laura replied, the fear clear in her voice. But I do know this, his presence is linked to something terrible. Something ancient. We can't escape him. We never have. I don't know how he does it, but he's part of us. And no matter how much we try to forget, he keeps showing up, reminding us that we can't escape. Sophie's head spun with confusion, her breath shallow. Aunt Laura, what happened to Grandma? Did she? I don't know, Aunt Laura interrupted, her voice breaking. But I think it's connected to him. I think he was waiting for her, and now he's waiting for you. Sophie dropped the phone, her vision blurring. She could feel the weight of Aunt Laura's words pressing on her chest, suffocating her. She didn't know what to believe, but she knew one thing for sure. The masked stranger had been watching her family for years, and now it was her turn to be caught in his web. As the evening stretched on, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the photograph in her hands, the masked figure's hollow eyes staring back at her. And she wondered, would she be the next to disappear into the shadows? The days that followed Sophie's conversation with Aunt Laura felt disjointed, as though she were living in a dream she couldn't wake up from. The photograph of the masked stranger lay on her desk, staring at her with those haunting, hollow eyes. She tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of light or some weird coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. Each time she looked at the photograph, it felt as though the stranger's presence grew stronger. At night, when she closed her eyes, she could almost feel him standing at the foot of her bed, his cold gaze pressing into her soul. She would jerk awake in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find the room empty and silent. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Sophie noticed something strange. She'd been reviewing more old family photographs, desperate for answers, when she saw it again. In another photo, this time of her parents at their wedding, the masked stranger was there, lurking in the background. His figure was slightly blurred, but unmistakably present. Sophie's stomach twisted. What was going on? How had she never noticed him before? The feeling that her family was hiding something from her intensified. Every photograph she uncovered only added to the growing sense of dread. It wasn't just one picture. It was dozens. The masked stranger appeared in every major family event, a figure out of place and yet eerily familiar. She decided to confront her parents. Sophie waited until the evening when both her mother and father were home, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine between them. She set the photo album on the coffee table between them, the picture of her grandparents and the stranger on top. I need to ask you both something, Sophie said, her voice tight. Do you recognize this man? Her parents exchanged a glance, a flicker of something Sophie couldn't quite place crossing their faces. Her father was the first to speak, his voice strained. That's nothing, Sophie. Just a weird coincidence. You know how it is with old photos, people show up in the background all the time. But Sophie wasn't convinced. It's not just one picture. It's in every single photograph I've found. At my christening, at Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary party, even at my birthday. He's always there, lurking in the background. How come no one ever mentioned him? Her mother's face paled, and Sophie saw her mother's grip tighten on the wine glass. You're imagining things, honey, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. No, I'm not, Sophie retorted, her voice rising. This man, he's in every photograph. Why hasn't anyone said anything? Why didn't you ever warn me? Her father's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing with a coldness Sophie had never seen before. Drop it, Sophie. There's nothing to talk about. But Sophie couldn't let it go. She had to know the truth. What happened to Grandma, Dad? Was it because of him? Is that why she's gone? Her father's face twisted with something dark, something Sophie couldn't comprehend. Your grandmother was a fool. She got too involved with things she shouldn't have. Things that don't make sense. Things that change you. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What are you talking about? But her father's voice grew low, and he stood up abruptly, walking toward the door. I said, drop it. Her mother, too, was silent, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Sophie sat there, her hands clenched into fists, her mind racing. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. She didn't know what it was, but she was determined to find out. Even if it meant uncovering the darkest secrets of her family. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, Sophie returned to the attic the following morning, determined to uncover more answers. She rummaged through boxes, old journals, and faded letters, but it wasn't until she came across a dusty old book that she felt a strange sense of urgency. The book was thick, bound in dark leather, and appeared ancient. Its cover was unmarked, except for a single symbol, a twisted mask. Sophie hesitated for a moment, but then opened it, flipping through the yellow pages. It was a diary of sorts, written by someone named Margaret Blackwell, her great-great-grandmother, it seemed. The entries began innocuously enough, with descriptions of family events and the births of children. But as Sophie read on, the entries grew darker, more cryptic. I met him today, one entry read. The man in the mask. He watches me, follows me wherever I go. But he is not like the others. There is something in his eyes, something ancient, something that calls to me. I cannot escape him. Sophie's breath hitched. The masked stranger? Her great-great-grandmother had written about him? As Sophie read more, the entries grew increasingly paranoid. Margaret spoke of strange dreams and waking visions of the masked man, always present, always watching. There was no escape. And then, in the final entry, Margaret wrote, "He will come for me soon. He always comes for those who try to forget. And when he does, there will be nothing left of me." The last page of the book was torn, and Sophie's hands shook as she set it down on the floor. This wasn't just a family oddity. This was something far worse, something ancient. Something that had haunted her bloodline for generations. Sophie could feel the weight of it, the presence of the masked stranger, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sophie spent the following days combing through every scrap of family history she could find. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her, that the masked stranger was drawing nearer with every passing moment. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, made her jump in terror. She knew he was watching, just like he had watched her ancestors. It wasn't until she spoke to Aunt Laura again that she understood the full scope of the danger. "I read the diaries," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "Aunt Laura, do you know what it means? This man in the mask, he's been following our family for generations." "What does it mean?" Aunt Laura's voice on the other end of the phone was strained. "Sophie, I warned you. It's not something you can escape. He's not a ghost, not a person. He's a manifestation of something darker, older than our family. He's a curse." Sophie's blood ran cold. "A curse? He doesn't just appear. He takes something. Something that's yours. Something that no one can ever replace. And once he takes it, you disappear. You become like everyone else who's come before you, just a faded memory in a photograph." Sophie sat there in stunned silence. She knew it was true. She could feel it in the air, in the suffocating silence around her. The masked stranger was real. And he was coming for her. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the masked stranger was closer than ever. The weight of his presence seemed to press on her chest with every passing day, like the air had grown thicker around her. Every time she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes would wander to the corners of the room, expecting to see him lurking there. But he was always just out of sight, his mask a looming, suffocating thing that threatened to take over every corner of her life. The photographs piled up on the desk before her, each one more unsettling than the last. It wasn't just her immediate family anymore. There were distant relatives in the images, old neighbors, even strangers who had long since passed. And each of them stood next to the same figure, his mask forever obscuring his face, his eyes staring at Sophie through the grainy, sepia-toned images. She didn't want to look at them anymore, but she couldn't stop herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them. The eyes behind the mask, watching her. One afternoon, while flipping through another album of old family pictures, Sophie stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold, a picture of her, standing as a young child next to her parents, her face beaming with happiness. But there, in the background, just over her left shoulder, was the masked figure. This time, he wasn't just lurking in the shadows, he was standing closer than before. Almost as if he were standing beside her. Her breath caught in her throat. The hairs on her arms stood up as she traced the figure with her finger. She had no memory of him being there. Her parents had always said the photos were taken during joyful moments, but now, with the added presence of the stranger, it felt as though every memory was a lie. For the first time in days, Sophie felt the ground beneath her shift. An unmistakable sense of dread took hold of her, and she knew, deep down, that something terrible was about to unfold. Sophie spent the next few days unable to shake off the increasing sense of unease. She couldn't focus on her work, couldn't even bring herself to leave the house. Something in her had snapped, and she knew that every day she remained in this house, the stranger grew closer. She hadn't heard from Aunt Laura since their last conversation, but Sophie couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. She needed to know why, for the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. Without hesitation, Sophie grabbed her keys and drove to the old farmhouse. The roads felt longer than usual, as though the world itself were slowing down to match her growing sense of dread. The house came into view just as dusk was settling over the horizon. The sky was thick with dark clouds, and the air felt heavy with an unseen weight. When Sophie knocked on the door, Aunt Laura opened it, her eyes wide with worry. "You came," she said quietly, almost as though she'd been expecting her. "I was afraid you wouldn't." Sophie stepped inside, but the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt the shift in the air. It was colder here, and the silence seemed to press against her, thick and suffocating. "I found something," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "I found him. He's in every picture, mine, my parents'. He's always there." Aunt Laura looked at her with a deep sadness in her eyes. "I warned you, Sophie. I told you not to go digging. But I have to know," Sophie pleaded. "I have to understand what he is. What he wants." Aunt Laura closed the door behind her and motioned for Sophie to sit. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask. But I suppose it's time. You deserve to know the truth." Aunt Laura sat across from Sophie, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly in her lap. "The masked stranger isn't just a man, Sophie. He's not a ghost. He's something older, something darker. He's a force of nature, a curse that has been following our family for generations." Sophie felt her heart drop in her chest. A curse? Aunt Laura nodded. Yes. The masked stranger has been haunting our bloodline for as long as anyone can remember. He appears in the background of our family photos, like a shadow, a presence we can't escape. And no one knows why. Sophie was stunned. But why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you warn me? I didn't want to scare you, Aunt Laura said softly. And I didn't want you to believe it. It's hard to believe in something like this. But it's real. And once you see him, once he's in your life, there's no escaping him. He's been in our family for generations, and now he's chosen you. Sophie's stomach twisted with fear. What does he want from me? Aunt Laura's eyes were filled with sorrow. He doesn't want anything from you, Sophie. He's not after your soul or your life. He takes something far worse than that. He takes your memories. He erases your existence, bit by bit. And when he's done, you'll be nothing more than a forgotten shadow in someone's picture. Just another faded face in the background. Sophie's head spun. But how can I stop him? How can I make it stop? Aunt Laura's voice grew quiet, almost a whisper. You can't. The only way to escape him is to give in. Accept it. Let him take what he wants. And you'll be free. But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. The words swirled around her head, but the only thing that was clear was that she couldn't let this happen. She couldn't lose herself. She couldn't let herself be erased. The next few days were a blur of panic. Sophie's mind raced as she replayed everything Aunt Laura had told her. There was no escape. The masked stranger had been haunting her family for generations, and now he was after her. His eyes were everywhere, behind every photograph, in every shadow, waiting for her to give in. Sophie tried to go about her life as if nothing had changed, but the weight of the stranger's presence grew heavier with each passing moment. The mask seemed to haunt her every waking hour. The feeling of being watched was constant, suffocating. She could no longer escape it. One night, while she sat in her living room, staring at the photographs on the wall, she noticed something new. The masked stranger was no longer just in the background. In one of the photographs, he was standing right next to her, his hand on her shoulder. His eyes were no longer hidden by the mask. They were open, staring directly into hers. Sophie gasped, her heart racing. She turned the photo over, her hand shaking, but there was no name on the back. No explanation. Just the unblinking stare of the masked stranger. Terror clawed at her chest. He was coming for her. But Sophie was determined. She wouldn't let him take her memories. She wouldn't become another faded face in the background. She wouldn't let him win. And so, with a resolve that felt as though it were coming from somewhere deep inside her, Sophie made a decision. She would confront him. She would face the masked stranger once and for all. The night Sophie decided to confront the masked stranger, the air felt different. It was thicker, colder, almost as though the world itself had stilled in anticipation. Her home, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in, the silence unbearable. Sophie stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the photographs, the haunting faces of her family, and the masked figure lurking in the background. He was always there, watching, waiting, Her pulse quickened as she glanced at the time. It was nearly midnight. She had no idea why, but she had a sense that something would happen at this exact hour, something she couldn't avoid. The wind howled outside, sending a chill through the windows, but Sophie didn't move. She was determined. She couldn't live like this any longer, not knowing what the stranger wanted, why he'd chosen her family, why he was stalking her every waking moment. With a final, deep breath, she walked over to the photo album where it all started, the old family photos her grandmother had passed down to her. As her fingers brushed the worn edges of the album, a sudden thought struck her. What if Aunt Laura was wrong? What if there was a way to stop this? The thought gave her a spark of hope, however fleeting. Perhaps this wasn't inevitable. Maybe she could change it. Maybe she could outsmart him. The room seemed to grow darker as she flipped through the pages. There, at the very end, was the most recent photo, her standing with her parents, their smiles frozen in time. And there, in the background, was the masked stranger, his form unmistakable. But something was different. This time, he wasn't just standing at the periphery. His figure had shifted closer, his head tilted slightly, his hand raised as if beckoning her. The mask looked more real than it ever had before, so detailed, as if it were no longer a part of the photo, but something tangible, like a phantom reaching out from the past. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she lifted the photo closer to her face. The eyes. The mask. It was almost as though the figure in the picture was staring directly at her. "Why?" she whispered aloud. "Why me?" The answer came in the form of a whisper, faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Because you're mine." The voice seemed to emanate from the photo itself, but also from within her mind, as though it was coming from the very fabric of the air around her. It was low, guttural, a sound that crawled under her skin. Sophie stumbled backward, dropping the photo to the floor, but the voice didn't stop. It kept coming, louder now, growing from a whisper to a snarl. "You've always been mine. You just didn't know it." The temperature in the room dropped, and Sophie's breath turned to vapor. She could feel him. He was in the room with her, and she couldn't see him, but she could sense his presence, the air pressing against her, closing in. "Who are you?" Sophie screamed, her voice shaking with terror. "Show yourself." For a long moment, there was nothing but the silence of the house. But then, with a sudden force, the air seemed to crack open, and the masked stranger stepped from the shadows, his tall, imposing figure filling the doorway. The mask, which had once seemed like nothing more than a strange, haunting detail in the photographs, now looked real, terrifyingly so. Its surface was gleaming in the dim light, with cracks running through the porcelain-like material, as though it had been worn for far too long. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, her legs trembling, her body frozen in place. He was no longer a shadow in the background of an old picture. He was here. In her world. In her home. "I've been watching you for years," the voice growled, though the figure's lips didn't move. "You've seen me in every photograph, in every corner of your life. And now, I'm here to take what's mine." The air became thick with dread, suffocating her, squeezing the air from her lungs. The masked stranger's eyes were hidden behind the mask, but Sophie could feel them, feel his gaze boring into her very soul. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to fill her with an overwhelming sense of loss, of forgetting, as though each second with him was erasing her existence from memory. Sophie fought to steady her breath. "What do you want?" she whispered. The stranger didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, his hand reached up, tracing the edge of the mask as though savoring the moment. "What I want is to finish what was started," he said. "To take you. To erase you. To make you nothing but a memory in someone else's photo." The realization hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just haunting her family, he was erasing them, one by one. He had been doing it for generations, slipping into their lives like a shadow, until there was nothing left but his presence in the background of photos. But Sophie wasn't ready to be erased. Not yet. With a surge of adrenaline, she forced herself to move. She grabbed the album from the floor, holding it out before her as if it were a shield. "No," she said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. "You don't get to take me. I won't let you." The masked stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his looming figure blocking out the light. Sophie's fingers clenched around the album, but she could feel the pull, like gravity itself was drawing her toward him. She knew, deep down, that she had no choice but to fight back. With a sudden, violent motion, Sophie threw the album toward the masked stranger, and as it hit him, the photographs inside fluttered out, scattering in the air like leaves. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the stranger, the photos, Sophie's heartbeat. Then, as if something had snapped, the masked stranger howled in pain, his form distorting, writhing in the air. Sophie didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran. Sophie's mind raced as she ran through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silent halls. She could still hear the masked stranger's shrieks behind her, but she refused to look back. The front door was only a few feet away now. She could almost taste freedom. But as she reached for the handle, a sudden, overwhelming darkness washed over her. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a suffocating presence, a force that gripped her very soul. Sophie turned around, her heart hammering in her chest. The stranger was there, standing in the doorway, his form now twisted and distorted. His mask was gone. In its place was a face she recognized. It was her own. Sophie screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the shadows that enveloped her. And then, just like that, the world went dark. The next morning, the sun shone through the windows, casting soft rays across the living room. The photographs, once scattered across the floor, were now neatly stacked on the coffee table. But there was something wrong. The photo album was gone. And in its place, a new picture sat on the table, one Sophie had never seen before. It was a family photo, but in the background, there was no masked stranger. There was only Sophie. Sophie, smiling. The rest of the faces had been erased. Story 6. The night air in Sam Carter's apartment was thick with the hum of his old laptop's fan. He was supposed to be writing a story about a local art exhibition, a mundane assignment, but his mind wandered. It often did when he was alone. There was something about the quiet hum of the internet that drew him in. The deeper he could dig into the darker corners of the web, the more the adrenaline surged. It felt like an illicit thrill, one that no one could see, no one could understand. His fingers moved slowly over the keys as he typed dark web forms into the search bar. He had written about conspiracy theories before, but this time was different. This wasn't a mainstream topic, it was something far more sinister. After several minutes of scrolling, his eyes landed on a link, Fatalist. The description below it was sparse, only a few cryptic words, predicts the date of your death. The list is endless. Sam's curiosity piqued. He heard rumors of a site that could predict the exact moment of someone's death, but he had always dismissed them as urban legends. People couldn't really know something like that, could they? With a steady breath, Sam clicked the link. The page that loaded was minimalist, cold, and clinical, almost like a database. The list of names scrolled endlessly, each one accompanied by a timestamp and a cause of death. The names weren't famous. In fact, many were unfamiliar to him, but that's what made it eerie. Sam clicked on the first name on the list, Daniel Pierce. The post read, Daniel Pierce, June 12, 2023, 3:17 p.m. Car accident on Route 47. He froze. The date was just 2 days away. Sam knew Daniel Pierce. He had reported on his charity events in the past. He quickly typed Daniel's name into a search engine. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the article headline, Local businessman missing after leading charity gala. Could it be? The article didn't say much about where Daniel had gone, only that he disappeared after the gala. Could this form be predicting his death? Sam sat back, unable to tear his eyes away from the screen. He refreshed the page, then refreshed it again. The names continued to scroll, each one more unsettling than the last. They weren't just random predictions, some of them had eerie precision. The dread settled deeper in his stomach. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. Sam couldn't stop thinking about Fatalist. He found himself returning to the site over and over, checking to see if the predictions were real, trying to convince himself that they were just coincidences. But as the hours passed and the predictions continued to come true, he felt himself losing control. The first death from the list had occurred exactly as predicted. Daniel Pierce had been found dead in a car accident at precisely 3:17 p.m. on June 12th. Sam had to admit it was too specific to be a coincidence. That night, Sam found himself reading the next post. A young woman named Olivia Green, her death predicted for July 2nd, 2023, at 10:45 a.m., blunt force trauma from a fall down a staircase. A few days later, Sam heard about Olivia on the news. She had tragically fallen down a staircase at her apartment building and died from head trauma. The time of death was eerily close to the one predicted on the website. The more Sam thought about it, the more obsessed he became. He couldn't let go of the idea that Fatalist was more than just a sick joke. He returned to the site again and again, poring over the lists of names, trying to understand the patterns. He read through hundreds of posts, and each one sent a shiver down his spine. His own name hadn't appeared yet. He had to admit, part of him was relieved by that. But that relief didn't last long. The compulsive visits to Fatalist became a constant part of Sam's life. He opened the site every morning, checked it during lunch, and then returned to it at night. The anticipation of seeing the next prediction, wondering who it would be, who would die next, it consumed him. But it wasn't just the deaths he was fixated on. It was the unsettling feeling that he had become part of something far bigger, something far darker. His work as a journalist suffered. Deadlines were missed, stories were left half-written, But there was something more troubling happening inside his mind. The predictions didn't just seem like a passive observation anymore. It was as if he could feel the pull of the site, a force that was drawing him deeper into its grip. Then, one night, the inevitable happened. He clicked on a new post, and there it was. Sam Carter, August 3rd, 2023, 8 p.m. Poison drink at a bar. His heart dropped. The cold text on the screen felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He stared at it, unable to blink, unable to move. Was this a joke? Was someone playing with him, tormenting him? Or was this a warning? Sam's mind raced. What kind of website could predict a death so specifically? The date, the time, everything was too precise. The thought that fatalists might have access to more than just public knowledge made him feel sick to his stomach. But Sam couldn't stop checking the site. The more he read, the more the site seemed to consume him. He was trapped in a loop. The clock was ticking toward his predicted death. The question haunted him, how had they known? The next few days passed like a fog, thick and oppressive. Sam couldn't escape the weight of the prediction hanging over him like a sword. He tried to distract himself, to pretend it wasn't real. But the more he fought it, the more the dread festered in his chest. The prediction was so precise, so unsettlingly accurate. What if it wasn't just a website? What if it was something more? The news of Olivia Green's death had shaken him, yes, but now that his own name was on the list, he felt his grip on reality slipping. He couldn't talk to anyone about it. They'd think he was insane, obsessed with a website that predicted deaths. His friends had already started to comment on his strange behavior. He'd spent hours locked in his apartment, refusing to answer calls, constantly refreshing Fatalist as if he could somehow prove to himself that it was all just a sick joke. But the predictions kept coming true. Every time he refreshed the page, the names continued to scroll, and Sam found himself watching, waiting for someone he knew to be next. The deaths were always close, always timed with terrifying precision. The young woman who fell down the stairs had her death predicted 2 weeks before it happened. A man named Paul Hughes had been predicted to die of a heart attack at exactly 2 p.m. on July 9th, and Sam had seen the news report the next day confirming it. Paul had collapsed while walking through the park. Sam's obsession with fatalists deepened as the predictions rolled in. His life became consumed with the ticking clock. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. The only thing that mattered was the sight. His own death was just a month away, and he couldn't shake the thought that it was approaching, creeping closer with each passing day. He couldn't stay passive anymore. Sam had to understand how this was happening. If the site could predict deaths, it could predict other things too, right? Maybe there was a way to trace it, to find out who was behind it, to stop it. If he could just dig deep enough, maybe he could unearth some clue that would save him. The first thing he did was to research the origins of Fatalist. But like everything else about the website, the information was sparse, contradictory, and buried deep. No one knew who had created it, or why it even existed. The domain had been registered anonymously, and no trace of any developer could be found. Some posts claimed the site was part of a government project, while others swore it was an ancient ritualistic tool passed down for generations. But no matter where he looked, every trail led to a dead end. He tried contacting the people whose deaths had been predicted, but no one wanted to talk. Of course, they didn't. Who would? How could you explain to someone that you were part of a cursed list of deaths, a list that seemed to predict things with unnerving accuracy? Sam began to feel the isolation seep into his bones, the feeling of being utterly alone and yet surrounded by a growing sense of inevitability. He checked the site again, just to make sure the prediction hadn't changed. He had to know. Sam Carter. August 3rd, 2023. 8 p.m. Poison drink at a bar. There it was, still there, unchanging, mocking him. The thought of walking into a bar, sitting down, and having a drink just to have it poisoned made him sick. He couldn't let that happen. He had to find a way out, to escape the fate that seemed written for him. A week before the predicted date, Sam finally did something he hadn't dared before. He reached out to the only other person who had shown any sign of wanting to escape Fatal List. On a forum where people had discussed the site, he found a post from someone named Eve. She had shared a chilling account of how she'd narrowly avoided a death predicted by Fatal List. Sam sent her a message. "I need to talk to you. You know about Fatal List, right? I think I'm next." He hit send and immediately felt the weight of the message hanging in the air. Would she respond? Would she think he was just another paranoid person spouting nonsense? A few hours later, a reply came through. "Get off the site, Sam. You don't understand what you're dealing with. It's not just a prediction, it's a pact. Once you know about it, you can't escape. But there's one way out." Her message sent a chill through him. What did she mean by a pact? And what did she mean by one way out? Sam had to know more, so he pressed her for more details. The response came slowly, almost reluctantly. The only way out is to stop visiting the site. The deaths won't stop, but the more you interact, the stronger it gets. The curse isn't just about predicting death, it's about making it happen. The words hit Sam like a punch to the gut. What was she saying? Was it too late for him? He was already obsessed with the site. He had checked it too many times. Would it be enough to just walk away? Sam felt his thoughts spiraling out of control. The fear, the obsession, the inevitable conclusion, it was all too much to bear. Eve's warning echoed in his mind, but it felt too late for him to turn back. Could he escape? Or had he already sealed his fate? The days leading up to August 3rd blurred together in a sickening whirlpool of dread. Sam's mind was a battlefield, constantly at war with itself. Eve's warning echoed in his head, but the curse of Fatal List had dug its claws so deep into him that every instinct screamed at him to check the site again. Just to make sure he was still alive. Just to make sure the date hadn't changed. And every time he opened the site, the countdown continued, the ticking clock of his fate growing louder with each second. The worst part was the silence. His phone remained eerily still, with no more messages from Eve, no calls, no more warnings. It was as if she had vanished, leaving Sam to face this horrible fate alone. His paranoia deepened. Were they watching him? Could the site influence what he did? Could it even influence his thoughts? One night, 3 days before the predicted time, he woke in a cold sweat. The images of the site burned into his mind like a branding iron. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. All he could see was his death, a poisoned drink, a bar, strangers watching from the shadows. He got out of bed, his movements mechanical, and sat at his desk. Without thinking, his hands reached for his laptop. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the keys. He had to look. He had to know. The page loaded. The same prediction stared back at him, Sam Carter. August 3rd, 2023. 8 p.m. Poison drink at a bar. Then, something changed. A small notification popped up at the top of the screen. It was a message. From Eve. It's already begun. Get out. Get out before it's too late. They've started watching you. There's nowhere to hide. But I can show you how to fight back. The only way to survive is to come with me. Sam's heart pounded as he read the message again, and then again. Fight back? Could it really be that simple? Was there a way to stop it? He typed back, his hands shaking. Where? How? Tell me everything. But as soon as he pressed send, the page refreshed. And the notification vanished. He checked his inbox. Nothing. No new messages. The dread sank deeper into his gut. Had it been real? Or had his own fear created the message? He ran his hands through his hair and felt his pulse in his temples. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't wait for his time to come. By the time August 3rd arrived, Sam was a shell of the person he used to be. He hadn't eaten, barely slept. He looked like a man walking towards his own funeral, only this time, he was awake enough to understand that there was no escape. He didn't go to work. Didn't go outside. All he did was watch the clock and wait for 8 p.m. to approach. Every second felt like an eternity. His mind was a storm of possibilities, each one darker than the last. What if it was a setup? What if Eve had been trying to help him, but he couldn't trust anyone now? And yet, even with all the warnings, even with the terror that gripped his heart, Sam couldn't escape the feeling that something was pulling him. Like gravity. Something out there, beyond the screen, was pulling him toward the inevitable. Around 7:30 p.m., he couldn't stand it anymore. His body moved on its own, like a marionette. He grabbed his jacket, slung it over his shoulders, and headed toward the door. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to be somewhere. Anywhere. He needed to prove something to himself. The night was humid, the air thick with the stench of oncoming rain. Sam found himself standing in front of a bar, one he had never been to before. Its neon lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the sidewalk. It was like it had been waiting for him. Just waiting for him to show up. The door creaked open as he entered, and the air inside hit him with a wave of stale beer and cigarette smoke. He scanned the room. Empty, save for a lone bartender who barely looked up from his phone. Sam approached the counter, trying to steady his shaking hands. He ordered a whiskey, knowing full well it was the exact drink he was supposed to be poisoned with. Was this it? Was this the end? The bartender slid the glass toward him. His hand brushed against Sam's, sending a jolt of cold fear through his body. It was too real. Sam took a slow, deliberate sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. The taste was familiar, comforting, but it did nothing to calm his mind. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could tell him what was happening. Why was he here? Why had he walked into this bar, knowing full well what was supposed to happen? He tried to remember Eve's words, how she had said he could fight back. But what did she mean? How could he fight something that felt like it had already been written? The countdown had already started. The sight had already predicted his death. What could he possibly do to stop it now? And then, just as the clock on the wall ticked over to 8 p.m., the bar door slammed open. A cold gust of wind rushed in, and for a moment, Sam thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow moving too quickly to be real. He turned his head, eyes widening in disbelief. There, standing across the room, was the figure from Fatalist. The figure from every prediction. The masked stranger. It wasn't just a shadow in his mind anymore. It was real. It was here. And it was coming for him. The stranger's eyes were hidden behind a dark, featureless mask, but Sam could feel the weight of its gaze. The room seemed to bend, the air pressing on him from all sides. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened and his heart pounded in his ears. It's time. The voice was a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Sam's vision blurred as panic overtook him. He couldn't see, couldn't think. His hands shook, his body frozen in place. But then, something inside him snapped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, and he jumped from his seat, knocking over the whiskey glass. The stranger took a step forward, but Sam didn't wait. He bolted for the door, desperate to escape, desperate to outrun whatever fate had been sealed for him. But the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. Locked. Sam's mind screamed as he turned around, his eyes meeting the masked figure's cold gaze. It was almost like the stranger was waiting for him to accept what was happening. To understand that the death wasn't just a prediction, it was a conclusion. Everything was happening too fast, too soon. Sam couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, in a sudden moment of clarity, he remembered Eve's last words. Get off the site. He didn't know how, but he understood what she meant now. The key wasn't to run from the inevitable. It was to defy it. To stop being a part of the cycle. With everything in him, Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew over the keys, opening Fatalist. The site loaded slowly, but there it was, his name. The prediction was still there. Without a second thought, he deleted the page. He deleted everything. In that instant, the masked figure stopped in its tracks. The air shifted. The tension in the room lifted, just a little, as if something had been broken. The door flew open. Sam didn't hesitate. He ran out into the night, breathing in the cool, free air. But as he ran, he couldn't help but wonder, had he really escaped? Or was this just the beginning? It had been 3 days since Sam deleted Fatalist. The feeling of escape had been exhilarating at first, like he'd slipped free from a noose that had been tightening around his neck for weeks. He'd run out of that bar, heart pounding, terror coursing through him, and yet, something about the calmness of the night air made him feel free. No more predictions. No more countdowns. For the first time in ages, Sam felt like he was in control again. Like he could finally breathe. But freedom was fleeting. And Sam soon realized that the shadows of his past actions didn't vanish so easily. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text message from Eve. "It's not over." He froze, his blood turning cold. How could it still be going on? He had deleted the website, removed the connection to whatever dark force had been manipulating him. How could it not be over? He opened the message with trembling fingers. "They know what you did. You can't escape them. Not by deleting the site. Not by running away. They will find you." Sam felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. She wasn't wrong. He had deleted the site, but the curse it had cast on him wasn't something that could be undone with a simple keystroke. What had he done? What had he unleashed by crossing the line? He tried to dismiss the feeling of dread, but it was there, lingering, like the scent of something foul that refused to leave the room. He glanced at the calendar on the wall. The date today was August 6th. The countdown on Fatalist had ended 3 days ago. Yet the feeling that something was still lurking, watching him, had only grown stronger. The next night, Sam sat in his apartment, lights off, the hum of the city far below him, and the silence in his room pressing in around him. He couldn't escape the thought that something was wrong. Something was still coming. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Eve. "You deleted the site." "But I didn't. I couldn't." "You have no idea what you've done, Sam. I can't stop them anymore." The curse was never just the site. It was us. All of us who visited. All of us who watched. Sam's eyes widened. What did she mean by all of us? The silence seemed to grow louder, filling the room with an almost tangible weight. His thoughts scattered. She wasn't talking about the predictions anymore. She was talking about something else entirely. A deeper horror. Suddenly, the screen on his phone flickered, and the background changed. A new message appeared, this time in an unfamiliar font, one that seemed to drip with darkness. "You thought deleting the website would free you. But it's too late. You're already a part of us." Sam's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. There it was again. That same sinister voice that had warned him. That same eerie presence. Without thinking, Sam rushed to the window and pulled open the blinds. He looked out over the city. The night sky stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent. But then, just below, in the shadows of the alley below his building, he saw it. A figure. Standing still. Watching. The same figure he had seen in the bar. The one that had been at the center of Fatalist. His breath caught in his throat. It was wearing the same mask, the same featureless face. And it was staring directly at him. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. But Sam could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it had been watching him for longer than just this moment. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. How could they still be here? How could this be happening? He had deleted the website. He had done everything he could to erase the curse. And yet, the figure didn't vanish. It stayed, locked in place, its presence a palpable terror that filled the room like a storm. The hours stretched long as Sam sat in his room, his mind spiraling. He couldn't stop looking at the window, even though he knew the figure was still out there. It was as though it had attached itself to him, a shadow that would never go away. He tried to call Eve, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, but there was no answer. No one could help him. There was no escape. The figure remained. Then, as the night deepened, he realized something. The curse wasn't just tied to the website. It wasn't just tied to the predictions. It had always been tied to them. Every person who visited Fatalist, every person who checked their fate, every person who let the site predict their end had become a part of it. A part of the darkness that hung over the world. And Sam had made the fatal mistake of trying to erase it. Trying to pretend it was all just a nightmare. The site had chosen him. It had picked him, marked him, and the countdown was never about the time left to live. It had always been about the time left before the curse fully claimed him. The figure outside was no longer just a harbinger of death. It was a messenger. A reminder. Sam had crossed a threshold, and now there was no going back. His phone buzzed again. You've crossed over, Sam. You thought you could escape, but you're one of us now. There is no death. Only us. We are forever. It was Eve's voice, but it wasn't her. Not anymore. Sam felt his pulse race as the words settled like lead in his stomach. They were true. Sam's fingers trembled as he picked up his phone one last time. The countdown had ended, but the curse had just begun. Sam stood up, feeling the weight of the room press against him. The air was thick with a sense of finality. He walked slowly toward the door, but before he could open it, the lights flickered. The room seemed to close in on him. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the door. Sam froze. He didn't want to answer. He didn't want to face whatever was waiting on the other side. But the knocking persisted, growing louder with every passing second until it was a deafening roar in his ears. He hesitated, but his hand reached out, turning the knob. The door creaked open. There, standing in the hallway, was the masked figure. But this time, it wasn't just one. There were dozens. They all stood silently, staring at him, their dark masks empty of emotion, yet full of a terrible hunger. And Sam understood then. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him to join them. The figure stepped forward, and as it reached out, Sam's vision blurred. His heart stopped, and his breath became shallow. The door slammed shut behind him. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, the last thought in Sam's mind was the same as the one that had haunted him for so long. It was never about escape. It was always about becoming one of them.